Good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Wednesday, July 20th. It is 9:31, and I would like to call this meeting back into order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board colleagues. Joining me today is Vice Chair Doreen D'Adamo, Board Member Sean McGuire, Board Member Nicole Morgan. With us as well is our Executive Director, Eileen Sobek, our two Chief Deputies, Eric Oppenheimer and Jonathan Bishop, our Chief Counsel, Michael Loffer. With us as well as our Clerk of the Board, Janine Townsend, and assisting her today is Courtney Tyler and Margie Argel. As you can see, this meeting is being webcast and recorded. It is also a hybrid meeting, so there is also an online component and an in-person component. For those online, you're either viewing us through our customary webcast on CalEPA's website or through the YouTube live web stream. But if you intend on commenting on any of today's items, you need to be on the Zoom platform. And if you are not on there yet, there are instructions on how to do so at the top of the agenda. If you're having any issues getting onto the platform, though, you can email the Clerk of the Board, Janine Townsend, at comment letters at waterboards.ca.gov, and she can help you get on. Once you are on the platform, your camera will be off, you will be on mute until it's your turn to speak on the item that you've indicated. For those of us here in the room, welcome. We're in the CalEPA building here in Sacramento, California. Please do look around. There are exits here. In case of an emergency, we'll actually calmly file out, get to Cesar Chavez Park and await further, I guess my time is up, and await further, await further instruction. And at that point, we'll be able to file back or understand what to do. Please, for those in the room as well, if you have your phones on, any noise-making devices, feel free to mute them. With that, I think we can get started. Today is the second day of our board meeting. We did public forum yesterday, so we'll start right into our agenda. And here with us is Eric Ekdahl, our head of the Division of Water Rights. Good to see you this morning.
Chair Esquivel, good morning, and good morning to members of the board. I'll provide a very quick drought update. If we can go to the next slide. Our rough outline will go through watershed-specific drought efforts and then turn it over to Division of Drinking Water. But as our start to the watershed-specific efforts, we actually do have a hydrologic update from staff from the Department of Water Resources and the United States Bureau of Reclamation. And so with that, I'll actually turn it over to them. I believe they are here virtually, and then we'll resume the drought update once their presentation is complete.
Good morning.
Good morning, Board Chair. Molly White, Water Resources, Department of Water Resources, and Manager of Water Operations. Good morning to you all, Chair Esquivel and Vice Chair D'Adamo. Today, I'm here with Kristen White. We'll be providing just an operation update for the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. Kristen, did you want to introduce yourself?
Molly, just a heads up, Kristen has not joined us yet.
Okay, excellent. So we'll get started here. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the reservoir conditions throughout the state, major reservoirs. Storages here are shown in dark blue and is shown across the plot. Many of the major reservoirs are below historical average. The historical average is depicted on the graph in the by the green line. The major project reservoirs are, as I mentioned, below average, with the exception of Folsom Lake. That stands at roughly historical average for this time of year. Shasta is at 52% of average. Oroville is at 62% of average, and New Melones is at 51% of average. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a snapshot or a depiction of the net Sacramento Valley accretions and depletions. Essentially, these are a net difference between the Sac Valley, the major reservoir releases, say from Shasta, Folsom, and Oroville, and the difference between those releases and the inflow coming into the Delta. And it does represent the valley losses, whether they're attributed to diversions, evaporation, soil absorption, et cetera. So this graphic itself represents from March through the end of the water year for historical accretion depletions, and then compared of previous critical years, 77, 2014, 15, and 2021, and comparing those to actually what we have been experiencing this year. So during the spring period, that March, April period, we typically do see a lot of variability in the accretions, as the fluctuations are primarily attributed to hydrology, whether it be wet or dry. Certainly we can see there in the April period, the spike in the accretions was evident just because of the above average April that we did have. Currently, the pattern is reflective of previous drought years, but surely the depletions are not quite as negative as what we have historically seen in drought years. These primarily attributed to the reduced diversions in the Sac Valley, as well as possibly curtailments. Next slide, please. All right, so Feather River, Oroville overview. So releases currently from the Feather River are currently at 4,000 CFS. We'll be modifying our releases from the Lake Oroville just as needed for the Delta, but surely be looking for opportunities to reduce our flows just for storage conservation as we continue up throughout the summer and into the fall period. Our projected end of September storage in Oroville is at around 1.2 million acre feet. Certainly a better storage than we saw last year. At the end of the water year 2021, we did experience a historical low in Lake Oroville at just under 800,000 acre feet. So we are coming in higher, about, projected maybe 400,000 higher, but certainly not where we want to be if dry conditions do persist. So we do expect if it is a dry fall that we would continue to see decreases in storage as we progress through the fall. And next slide. So this comparison, so here's a Lake Oroville plot. We're at just under 1.6 million acre feet. This is compared to 2020, kind of the first dry year in the stretch of 3 so far in red. And then last year, 2021, kind of sandwiched right in between there with these dry years. So faring better than last year, but worse than 2020. And next slide. And with that, I will pass it over to Kristen White. Hi, Kristen.
Hey, Molly, thanks. Sorry about a couple minutes late, having some connectivity issues. All right, so it's a quick overview for Shasta Trinity. First, I'm going to talk about the reservoirs. I've got a Shasta temperature slide after this. I'll talk about temperature specifically. So where we are with releases is 4,500 CFS. I think we've talked about the agreed upon schedules in the past. We expect to be around that flow through mid to late August, and then sometime in late August, early September, we'll start ramping down to our minimum flow of 3,250 by October 1st. Right now, our end of September projected storage is about 1.4 million acre feet. That is quite a bit higher than what we expected back at the beginning in the spring when we started doing our planning, which I think we expected a little over 1.1 million acre feet, so doing pretty well there. However, it is possible that storage will continue to decrease if we get into an extreme dry fall scenario. And that's a theme you'll see with all these reservoirs. Going over to Trinity, which is less great. We're releasing about 450 CFS from Lewiston to the Trinity River. That's expected to last through mid-October. Right now, we're bringing over somewhere around 335 CFS from Lewiston into Whiskeytown Reservoir, which comes into the Sacramento River through both Clear Creek and Spring Creek Power Plant. Those exports or imports, depending on which basin you're looking at it from, are really set to reduce the residence time in Lewiston. So the more water we have coming in and going out of Lewiston, the shorter the water, shorter the time the water stays in there, which decreases how much it heats up from the ambient air temperature. Lewiston is a very large, shallow pool, so reducing that residence time is critical for temperatures in the Trinity River. So right now that's at 335 CFS, but because that's the primary purpose of that water, that may decrease, and we'll be looking for opportunities to modify that throughout the summer and into the fall. Storage is definitely not great. Projected storage for end of September right now is 470,000 acre feet, and it may continue to drop if we have dry fall conditions. Next slide. So if we look at Shasta, we've got 2020 and 2021 plotted on these charts along with this year. And you can see due to the extreme decreases in diversions in the Sac Valley due to both the reductions from rice growing and senior water right diverters and curtailments throughout the system, we are seeing significantly less water coming out of Shasta this year. And as you can see, we had just crossed, I think right around late June, we crossed the same storage that we were at this time last year. So even though we started significantly lower than we started last year, so last year started just under, right around 2.2, and this year we started just around a million, or I think it was like just over a million acre feet. We are expected to end quite a bit higher than that and higher than we did last year. So with the 1.4 projected storage. So that's good news. Still very low storage. We'd still like to see significantly higher storage in Shasta, and hopefully we can get that soon. All right, next slide. Okay, going to Trinity, we do not see that same pattern at Trinity. Trinity's been having pretty minimum releases, so we're not seeing huge changes in storage, but it also had very low inflow, so we're not seeing big bump ups in storage either. I mean, you can see our storage this year is lower than it was in both 2020 and 2020. Next slide. Okay, so Sacramento, sorry, this should say Sacramento River temperature management. We also often think about it as Shasta temperature management because that's where the temperature control device is. So this slide has a few things going on. I'll walk you through. So starting with the black dashed line, these are the temperatures we're seeing at the SAC gauge, which is where we set our temperature compliance point in our temperature management plan this year. So you see that's been fluctuating. Then we have the red lines. Those are what the temperature management plan set as our target. So you can see it was warmer earlier in the year and then cooler once we got to, I think it was June 7th. That's when we moved our temperature compliance to 54.5 at the SAC gauge. Then we have the purple line is flows. Those are the Keswick releases coming out and getting to their July numbers that we just discussed. And then we have the shaded line, which is the ambient air temperature. So you can see that started lower back in May and has unfortunately continuously been going up, except for our very, very cool July 4th weekend. I think it was one of the coolest July 4th on record. So you can see that big dip down there. So as you can see, we've done pretty well staying below our target. We did have 2 days in mid-June. I think that coincided with some heat, and we saw a big bump up in the release temperature. So we did those green circles, or when we made a gate change. So as soon as we saw those increases, we made a gate change, and that pulled it back down. But other than that, we've been pretty good, staying below those targets. We did get very, very close a couple of days ago at 54.49, but we stayed just under it, and we did make a gate change, and that has dropped back down. So we're in pretty good spot temperature management wise. Next slide. Okay, quick overview of Folsom for Folsom and New Melones. Folsom is at 4,500 CFS right now. Real-time ops change every day. We're always looking at the system. So when we finalized this last night, we thought it'd probably be at 4,500 through July and then start decreasing in August. But Delta conditions are allowing us to take a cut a little bit earlier. So we'll actually be dropping down to 4,250, I think, this Friday. So just a little bit earlier than expected. But we will be ramping down to our minimum flow, which is just over 1,300 sometime, probably across September, to get down to that flow sometime in early August. Storage is projected to be at or above 300,000 acre feet. Right now, it's looking on target to be a little bit higher than that, but we'll see how quickly we can ramp down in September. And it could continue to decrease under dry flow conditions. Temperature management on the American River, we are targeting 66 degrees at Fair Oaks through the summer, and we're on track to meet that currently. And then moving to the Maloney's, right now our minimum flow is 150 CFS, but we are at 300 CFS, meaning dissolved oxygen standards. So depending on how dissolved oxygen is reading, it may decrease to as low as 150. And end of September productive storage is 660,000 acre feet, which is it would be a great number for some reservoirs, but for New Maloney's it's very low. It's a very low refill rate, so that's not a good number and not a good entrance to get 2023 main scribe. Next slide. All right, so we can see looking at Folsom, we have actually been above average for much of this year, which has been great. I did want to note over about the past week, we've had some issues with the gauge reading up there. So we see those kind of weird little jumps in the graph. And if any of you are actually looking at the real-time data, you might have been confused. We did not have a huge deluge of rain or a massive evaporation event. We have a gauge error. So we're working on that and hoping to fix that in the near future as quickly as possible. But this is roughly about where we're at. So we are coming down quite a bit from our peak storage that we hit right around the end of May. And I think we have just now hit average storage, which is pretty good, pretty well above where we were last year when we were at our absolute minimum goals trying to preserve public health and safety. Next slide. And then looking at New Maloney's, graphic very similar to Trinity's graphic, where we have been and are heading to be well below where we were the last 2 years. Next slide. All right, and I'll pass it over to Molly to wrap it up.
All right, so looking ahead, so this graphic here just shows a comparison between the end of water year 2021, the actual storage conditions, comparing those to the projected storage conditions here at the end of water year 2022, end of September. So as we've noted throughout talking about Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom, we certainly are projecting to have better storages as it relates to the end of the water years in comparison to last year, but about 30% higher than last year. But however, it's still below average where we typically fall at the end of the water year in any given year. We continue starting planning for a potential dry 2023 as we progress, through the summer and into the fall. We're certainly looking for opportunities to maximize storage conservation by reducing releases. Coordination, communication is critical just amongst our state and federal partners, as well as our water users and stakeholders. We do continue, and we will be through the end of the water year, continuing to update our drought contingency plans. And at this point, we'll be back here providing additional hydrology operations updates to you all as needed in the future. And with that, Kristen, I don't know if you had anything addition to add. And so with that, that's a wrap up for this update, and I'll open up to questions.
Thank you both. I just really appreciate what I know we've often characterized here as unprecedented conditions. Glad to hear we're in better shape coming into the end of this water year than last. That 1.4 million acre feet at Shasta is particularly, I think, important to note that here, amongst still a bad year, we're at least a bit better than we were last year. And I think that that's because of the efforts of many, and I just want to acknowledge that. But and here appreciate as well that we're already thinking about next year as a dry year. We have to. And I think that what we see that it has afforded us this year is better planning and a little more of a balance, where here currently there isn't a temporary urgency change petition, there isn't a relaxation of standards, and the projects have been here better, here all collectively, all better balancing as best we can. Appreciate the nod as well, as curtailments fit into all of this picture, and important as we transition to the next item to kind of have that as some of our context for our discussion. So just thank you. I know these are, again, not undifficult times. I guess my question is perhaps, being able to, and I know that there's still a lot of variables to factor in, but do you see potential need for a TUCP coming into the fall or the winter, or what are some of the perhaps thoughts or sidebars around when we would know if we would need one, or what the benefit might be to the system here amongst, I know what are many different tools that we'll all be looking at to prepare for next year. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any insight yet, and if not, I know that there's still a lot of variables, as I said.
There's certainly quite a bit of uncertainty as we look into the fall. The one of the things as we go into the fall with the fall standards, we do have different knobs that turn, and at this point don't expect a TUCP for those early fall months. But again, we'll see what Mother Nature brings us, and we'll be continually to monitor and assess and keep you all apprised.
Yeah, I'm reminded of last year with that incredibly wet October. And so we'll just see how the start of the water year shapes up for us. Anything from fellow board colleagues, please, Vice Chair.
Well, thank you for the presentation, and I concur with you, Chair Esquivel. It's just really heartening to see how the improved coordination and a lot of voluntary actions that have been taken have seemed to have really made a difference that we can see, which is great, instead of just assuming that. And so my question is, as we go forward with future updates, I'd be curious to see specifically on curtailments, the difference that it appears to have made, as opposed to stating that it's a factor. But how could you quantify the benefits of, say, Term 91 as opposed to the curtailment reg? I'm not expecting you to have an answer today, but just in future updates, I think that would be helpful. And then the other question that I had, and I suspect this might be more for our staff, but looking at end of year storage on some of the main project reservoirs, just curious about Southern California, some of the reservoirs there, and getting a better idea of how some of the management actions that we've been hearing about in Southern California, reduced watering schedules, that sort of thing, how that has translated to a different picture on end of year storage in some of the main reservoirs in Southern California.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Board member.
Yes, thank you. I, again, also appreciate the presentation and you just being here today to share sort of the latest update. And I do take into consideration that these are the numbers that we're seeing all reflect the significant reductions in deliveries that folks across the state have been experiencing. So agricultural side, urban side as well. So here we are. And so I'm thinking, always thinking about the next year. And you talked about, we're not quite, where we would want to be at this time of the year. And, you're thinking about operations planning for 2023. So I just would really appreciate next time, or at the right time, just an update on what those steps are. How are you looking at forecasting, operations planning for next year? How are you taking into consideration all the improvements you've made in forecasting and those investments? And do you feel that the tools and the actions that the board have taken to date, and curtailments included in that space, have been sufficient? And so I just would really welcome, sooner rather than later, that conversation. I think it's never too soon. Obviously, we don't know what the fall will bring in terms of precipitation, as you've mentioned a few times there. We have no idea what the winter will bring either. Nonetheless, we have a sense for how the last few years have treated us, and that is unpredictably. And so just wanting to have a good sense of the bookends of the reality of different scenarios that we might expect and how those might impact the timing of various decisions and actions that we may need to take. So thank you.
Thank you, Board Member. Board Member Morgan, just no. Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Anything further that wanted to reflect on, Ms. White or Ms. White? Okay, thank you. And again, appreciate your time here this morning. Hand it back over to Mr. Ekdahl.
Thank you. And let's see, we'll jump right back into our general watershed overview. In the Bay Delta, it says tomorrow. We were anticipating that this presentation was going to be yesterday, and then it moved. So today, item 10, in just a few minutes, will be the proposed readoption of the Bay Delta Emergency Curtailment Regulation. Anticipated, if the regulation is readopted, that between July 21st and 25th, we would issue the notice of proposed rulemaking, submit to the Office of Administrative Law between July 28th and August 2nd, which would result in an OAL approval sometime in early to mid-August. Just as a reminder, the curtailment orders are still in effect from our existing E-reg, and I'll show those in a moment, and that regulation is posted online. Next slide, please. If we do look at the status of curtailments in the Delta watershed, we've put together a table here. There's a lot of things to read in a short time frame, but the general gist is that most of the Delta watershed as a whole is seeing curtailments to either about 1900 for the San Joaquin watershed. So anywhere that says watershed in the middle column, it means that that watershed or sub-watershed is curtailed to the status of the broader watershed at about 1900 in the San Joaquin. In the Sacramento, which is about midway through the table, it says 1917. That was as of July 13th. There was an update that went out yesterday, and that watershed curtailment for the Sacramento has dropped down to 1916. So a change of 1 year. But in general, the number of curtailments is still about the same. Next slide, please.
Sorry, can you just go back real quick? I just want to make sure I'm understanding this slide. So where it says Sacramento watershed, so 1917, 1916.
Yep.
So the ones above that, Sacramento Valley floor, for example, would be the same.
Correct.
1917, 1916.
Correct.
Okay.
And where it says riparian, then that would mean that everybody is curtailed, including the riparians in that watershed or sub-watershed.
Could you talk a little bit more about that, on how you managed, a correlative curtailment in those
Absolutely.
watersheds?
Absolutely. You'll see that riparian isn't in there very often, and where it is in there, it's generally smaller sub-watersheds or more dry sub-watersheds. And in those circumstances, based on the analysis from the California Nevada River Forecast Center, there really is no natural flow, period. And so in that circumstance, it's easy because we're not trying to correlatively divide out amongst the riparians. There's just no water unless it's previously stored water or some other contractual agreement. Okay, next slide. For Mill and Deer Creek, as of July 1st, 2022, there are no in-stream flow requirements in effect specific to the minimum in-stream flow fisheries needs. There may be other kind of watershed scale curtailments, but the minimum in-stream flows for fisheries were lifted as of that time, and they'll come back into play later in the fall if the board considers for readoption those renewed E-regs later, I think in August or September. Next slide, please. In the Russian River, we do have curtailments. The voluntary water sharing agreement is up and running. I believe we have about 135 participants, which accounts for well over 100,000 acre feet of water. So that is up and running and in effect. We are waiting to see whether the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is going to accept PG&E's Potter Valley project variance. If FERC does, and depending how FERC does, there may be the need to go to more significant curtailments throughout the entire watershed and put the voluntary water sharing program kind of on abeyance until there are more substantial flows or water availability. But we're kind of waiting to see, and we haven't heard a ton of information from FERC on that process. They've been very closely held and are kind of deliberating and awaiting their decision. Next slide, please.
And while I know the uncertainty of that can maybe cloud the achievement, I just want to make sure I acknowledge that was incredibly significant to see. And, and really the work that went behind it, the similar work that is called for throughout the state, doesn't diminish it, and just want to make sure I call attention to it. Thanks.
And a huge acknowledgement to staff and the diverters in the Russian River, who really kind of drove the effort as a whole and made it happen. And we helped out certainly, but it was the actual water right holders and diverters that really advocated for it and kind of put it together. You can see the effects of both kind of increased diversions from Potter Valley into the Russian River, as well as the effects of curtailments and the water sharing agreement in our current storage levels in Lake Mendocino. And you can see it's, if anything, kind of slowly crept up or held steady, and that's a remarkable change relative to last year. Next slide, please. In the Scott and Shasta River, in the Scott, curtailments were reinstated as of July 14th for all surface water and groundwater flows in the watershed. July minimum flow target called for by the emergency regulation is 50 CFS. As of this morning, flows in the Scott at the Fort Jones gauge were about 20 CFS. So things are dropping rapidly there, and curtailments are wrapping up, although we do have, I think, well over 10,000 acres of groundwater irrigation enrolled in local cooperative solutions, where those diverters are voluntarily saving 30% or more relative to their 2020 or 2021 use. And so that's again, a significant accomplishment for those landowners, and a huge note of thanks for their continued engagement and work in both with us, with CDFW, Fish and Wildlife, and then other resource entities within the valley itself. In the Shasta, curtailments were reinstated March 15th for most junior water right diverters. The July minimum flow is 50 CFS there. As of this morning, flows in Wairika were 40 CFS. And so we are contemplating increasing the depth of the curtailments in the Shasta. I think right now they go back to about 1900 or 1915, and I may have misspoke there, but I'll verify that. But we're looking at going back to about 1885 and increasing the depth of the curtailments in order to raise the flows to hit that 50 CFS target. And a quick bullet that the local cooperative solutions, we do have the ones that are approved posted, and then there's guidance and just kind of general directions on how to work and put one of those together on the web link listed there. Next slide, please. Additional information are our typical links and subscription lists. And again, encourage folks to sign up for any of those subscription lists to keep up to date with more real-time kind of news and updates. And with that, I believe we'll turn it over to the Division of Drinking Water, unless there are any questions here.
Thank you, Mr. Echtel.
Hello, board members. This is Eric Zuniga with our Division of Drinking Water Drought update for this board meeting. I have about 3 slides to share, so let's go to the first slide. So I'm gonna share a little bit of an update on the drought triage list that we have here. We have increased the total number of drought orders by 1. Seville is actually the newest water system that's receiving a drought order due to some drought concerns with their well, and I'll highlight that a little bit in the next slide. The number of drought warning systems, we actually increased it by 2 water systems. East Orosi and William Fisher popped up on the list, but they are non-drought related due to mechanical issues, but they're still water outages, which is why we are tracking them on the drought warning list. And then we reduced it by 1 system, moving to an emergency status. So that is a net increase by 1 for the drought warning systems. And then for the drought emergency systems, we've increased by adding Tullyville and now Seville for intermittent water outages. So we've increased those by 2. Both systems have received deliveries of hauled water and have had reported water outages and not consistent water outages, but definitely intermittent water outages. 4 of those systems have still not reported, and we're not sure of their status, but we do believe they're still in emergency. We do have a new round of drought orders that is being briefed out to board members this week, and we will have a public workshop targeted for August 9th for those water systems identified in the drought order list, so that they can be aware of how how they were selected and how to report into our portal. So that is an effort that's going to be a complete overhaul, not completely complete, but definitely an overhaul of the system we've been using over the last year with the new set of orders, new faces, new systems on the list. It's going to change up things quite a bit in my next update. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Seville as our drought spotlight. So on the weekend of July 9th and 10th, the water system reported a loss of pressure and outages at several locations, several customers that reported that. DFA funded self-help enterprises to provide bottled and hauled water deliveries, and the system mostly maintained some pressure. We also have a regional funded program through Tulsa's bottled water funding. They also have about 40% of the people covered in that bottled water program already. The Division of Drinking Water District Office issued a boil water notice. That's with emergency conservation measures to be in place 7/11. So hopefully that is helping the water system stay in pressure. I did have word from a meeting we just had recently that their well is catching up. Their hauled water deliveries are improving their backup storage tanks of supply, which is going to give the well an ability to rest and then recover and be able to continue to supply the system. So we're hoping over the next week they'll need some more hauled water, and then they'll be off the emergency and actually go back to warning. They were in warning when I wrote this, but they headed to emergency, and now they're going to be back into warning over the next week or so, is what we anticipate. Their long-term solution is a consolidation project that we are funding with YETIM that is in the second and final phase of construction. The first phase was to prepare the system for the interconnection by upgrading the system, getting meters, getting button up the leaks in the system. And the second and final phase is really the intertie that's going to connect the two systems together. So that is our solution for Seville as that goes forward. Next slide, please. So this is our dry well update. So reporting from the Department of Water Resources, we're 13% higher number of wells reported. So it's still increasing from the previous month, from the previous 30 days. The last time I actually reported 139 dry wells. This time it's 211 dry wells that are reported in the last 30 days. So dry well reports are roughly coming in at the same frequency as in 2015 is what we're noticing. And definitely Southern Central Valley is the hot spot for these dry wells. As far as the top 5 wells, top 5 counties experiencing the highest number of dry wells, that includes Fresno, Tulare, Madera, Butte, and Tehama. We actually have 16 counties now. DFA doesn't have a presentation this time for the drought update, but we used to have 15. Now we have 16 because of Shasta County. Shasta County is our newest coverage for these county funding programs for hauled water. So that brings us up to a total number of 16. And then the last bullet is that there's a total of 52 water systems that are missing at least one report for the drought reports. So ongoing efforts to continue to have systems continue to report. And that was my last slide, unless there are any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zuniga. I appreciate. I know that there have been a number of emergencies that we've been having to respond to with our partners, Self-Help and others on the ground. And this is, and here important to note that for some of the systems that we're encountering, it's not drought related directly, insofar as it's not a well that here has a level that's declined its ability to pump. It's sometimes failing infrastructure generally. And just reminded of the incredible programs we're fortunate to have here at the state level now, which is really making a huge difference in this drought than in last. where within 24 hours, we're able to get communities connected back to water, get at least interim solutions in place as we continue to really tackle this challenge of failing systems. And so our effort is split between systems that we regulate, those that are 15 permanent connections or 15 connections and greater of size, but there's a lot of smaller systems out there and homes on domestic wells. And so across that entire spread of drought impact and work, I'm proud that we're able to be able to respond this way. So thanks for the update. Any questions from fellow board colleagues? Okay, hearing none. Thank you again, Mr. Zuniga.
Thank you.
And then I think that may wrap up our informational item. Ms. Rechtel, anything further? Okay, thank you. That concludes that.
We do have
Oh, I
a couple
apologize.
public commenters.
We have commenters. I apologize. I can sometimes get completely ahead of myself. We do have two commenters. And so at this time, I'd like to be able to hear from Peter Martin from the city of Santa Rosa, who will be followed by Hia Rivers. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the State Water Board. My name's Peter Martin. I'm the Deputy Director of Water Resources for Santa Rosa Water. Just today, I wanted to take the opportunity in public comment to sort of share some of the highlights and successes that Santa Rosa Water has had in our response to the current drought. The city of Santa Rosa, located in Sonoma County, we first started our water conservation program in 1978 in response to the historic 76-77 drought. And since the 1990s, we've invested in over $21 million on water conservation programs, mostly replacing over 56,000 inefficient toilets and removing over 3.8 million square feet of turf, as well as implementing numerous additional conservation programs that have resulted in our total water use decreasing by 14% compared to 1990. And this is all despite a 53% increase in population. As you're probably aware now, the Russian River watershed in Sonoma County is in the midst of drought conditions for the third consecutive year. It was during the dry winter of 2020-2021 that Santa Rosa Water first launched our water saving campaign and began investing in significant outreach and marketing, as well as hosted several unique COVID-safe events to distribute tools and resources to help our community save water. As dry conditions persisted, and in April of 2021, Governor Newsom held a press conference declaring a drought emergency inside the dry shores of Sonoma County Water Agency's Lake Mendocino. We as a region and the Russian River water supply contractors responded immediately and began asking our customers to save water right now. Together, we have what is called the Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership, which is a group of 13 utilities in Sonoma and Marin counties. We've pretty much dedicated ourselves to a robust regional drought campaign with the tagline, "Drought is here, save water." This includes easily recognizable print, digital, and radio ad buys, as well as customizable social media toolkits and outreach materials that really suit the needs of each of these utilities. And I just want to point out that we too are planning ahead together for the possibility of another dry year. The city of Santa Rosa ultimately declared a stage 3 water shortage emergency in June of 2021. We required our customers to institute a mandatory community-wide reduction in water use and that's compared to 2020. And along with that, there were several mandatory restrictions on water use as well. I do want to note that as of today, we're still implementing stage 3 of our water shortage contingency plan, which requires a 20% reduction in water use. Ultimately, we've seen a cumulative 17% reduction in total water use over the last year when compared to 2020. And this is despite, as I mentioned earlier, customers already making significant water use efficiency investments over the past few decades. Much like last summer, we anticipate our cumulative savings will increase as we head into the summer months, where there's greater potential for water savings outdoors. I just want to note too that the drought response has really been a high priority for our utility. In terms of actionable items since early 2021, we've distributed over 3,000 specialized drought kits to our customers in Santa Rosa, implemented water waste patrols, and responded to over 1,000 water waste reports. And ultimately, we've distributed over 19,000 individual water-saving devices. We've also increased our turf conversion rebate to $1.50 per square foot of turf removed and conducted over 400 water smart home checkups. And since 2019, we've invested over 22,000 hours and $2.5 million in finding and fixing leaks in our system. In closing, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share this information with the State Water Board as we all work together to respond to this critical drought. Santa Rosa certainly appreciates the State Water Board's leadership and staff efforts during this drought, and also your recognition of the varied conditions throughout the state. Also, further, we just appreciate the allowance of water retailers to continue to implement drought response as dictated by our adopted water shortage contingency plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I appreciate that what we've seen in the Russian River is a pretty incredible response that has spanned both conservation numbers that are really critical. I know some systems up in the 30–40% conservation need because of a day zero, right? Because of the real threat that is facing the community, but the response that we've seen both in the conservation side, but also in the water rights side, and because to your point, it was the first watershed last year that we began working in, became very much the model, I feel, and in many ways, more than one, certainly. And one of the most important ones is that what we've seen certainly this last year and throughout the years is what makes a difference in emergency response and drought response here is the local leadership to engage with challenging issues, but to send the right message about the threat and the urgency of what's facing our communities. And certainly the Russian River watershed doesn't have the State Water Project or Central Valley Project. There are other projects, as we know, that do benefit the watershed, but nonetheless, because the resources are all kind of encompassed amongst yourselves, it's been incredible to see the response. And so I appreciate you highlighting the work that your agency has been doing. And here key again is that it's taken a real collaborative effort and a seriousness about the threat to push this work. And so I appreciate it. Any comments from fellow board colleagues? Vice Chair, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Martin, for the report. I always like to ask the question about what communities are doing to address prevention of tree mortality with these increased efforts that have been underway in your community. And I know, especially in your area, there's a big fire risk as well. So what has your messaging been, and do you get the sense that it's getting through?
Should be allowed to unmute here momentarily.
Yeah, forgive me. I got trigger happy with that mute button. Yeah, so we've been hosting workshops specifically on tree care. We partner with some local nonprofits on that. In the era of Zoom, it's been really nice too, because those can be recorded and people can rewatch those. But yeah, definitely focusing on tree care health and shrubs and those hardened pieces of landscape are important. And so we do communicate that often to our customers.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you, Vice Chair. We can go on to our next speaker then. And we have next Kia Rivers from Community Water Center.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you for this opportunity, or thank you for this informational drought update and the opportunity to provide comments today. My name is Kia Rivers, and I'm a policy advocate at Community Water Center, highlighting the need to protect small disadvantaged communities' access to drinking water. Disadvantaged communities' access to reliable, clean, and affordable water is not guaranteed. Additionally, as the drought persists, disadvantaged communities' already compromised access to water will become increasingly threatened. Unfortunately, within the last week, it has been clear how unreliable disadvantaged communities' access to water is. Recently, to our knowledge, at least 4 disadvantaged communities' access to water have been compromised. These communities include East Orosi, Seville, Yedem, and a very small water system located in Monterey County. The well failure that occurred in East Rosie last week was devastating, as not only did 700 residents lose access to water, but a family also lost their house to a fire that could have been potentially saved if there was running water. Because of a broken pump, the residents of East Rosie went without water for 5 hours. Even though the situation is heartbreaking, I would like to express our gratitude for the SAFER program and the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. Without these programs, it would not have been possible to provide replacement water in a timely manner. A similar well failure occurred in Seville and Yedem. In this case, the well's pump stopped working, believed to be because of low groundwater levels. The communities were able to receive hauled water in order to repressurize the tank and restore water to the community. However, this is a short-term fix for a much bigger problem. Additionally, a community leader reached out to Community Water Center last week asking for assistance to find funds to fix and drill a deeper well. Initially, the well, which serves only 11 households, only needed to repair the well casing. However, Monterey County later informed them they would also need to drill a deeper well in order to avoid potential nitrate contamination. The community does not have the financial capacity to do so and is currently struggling to find assistance that is applicable for community wells that have minimal connections. With the events that happened last week, it is apparent that long-term drinking water solutions must be prioritized. More specifically, well consolidation projects must be expedited in order to provide lasting relief to disadvantaged communities like the ones mentioned here today. Additionally, to further protect small disadvantaged communities, groundwater extraction must be reduced. As the drought continues, groundwater over extraction will only exacerbate the effects of the drought and increase the number of vulnerable communities impacted by it. This week, as GSA submits their revised plans, which originally did not consider domestic drinking water needs, I encourage the State Water Board and Department of Water Resources to work together to ensure that drinking water needs are truly protected in these revised plans. Thank you, Board, for the opportunity to provide comments today.
Thank you, Ms. Rivers, for your comments and for highlighting the important work that's going on, and especially around consolidations, where we definitely need to continue to prioritize the work and find local partners that are also in agreement that having so many small failing systems in the state is hampering our ability to provide universal access to clean water in the state, to fulfill the human right to water, and that we need to all see in common the future scale of and here consolidation of our drinking water systems and wastewater as well. Those two go very much hand in hand. So appreciate your comments and advocacy here. Okay, that wraps up our commenters for this drought informational item. And unless there's anything further from the board members, hearing none, thank you. We can now move on to item number 10, which is consideration of a proposed resolution revising our readoption of curtailments in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Watershed. I was balancing between taking a break or not, but we can do so later. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and board members. My name is Diane Riddle. I'm one of the Assistant Deputy Directors in the Division of Water Rights. I will be introducing agenda item number 10, proposed readoption of the curtailment and reporting regulation for the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Watershed. Next slide, please. So first, I'll just provide a brief overview of what the staff presentation includes today. Today, staff from the board's Division of Water Rights will provide a brief overview of the proposed changes to the emergency regulations, comments we received on those proposed changes. Then staff will provide a brief overview of the water unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed that the emergency regulation relies upon, as well as its recent refinements and comments that we've received related to the methodology. We'll then conclude with next steps and a timeline. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the extensive and excellent team of staff that we've had working on the emergency regulation and water unavailability efforts over the past year and a half. They've continued to do an excellent job refining the methodology, responding to public input, and just staying on top of all things related to the curtailment. So really appreciate all of their efforts. I also wanted to acknowledge the input and coordination that we've had with the water user community and other stakeholders. That's been invaluable. We've really appreciated the ability to collaborate and consult with those stakeholders. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this slide. This slide provides a timeline of the action since the board adopted the curtailment and reporting regulations last year. I'd like to highlight essentially that this slide identifies that we've had an ongoing process to refine the methodology, received public input through workshops, and continue to make improvements. We, as a reminder, we adopted the emergency regulations that are currently in effect on August 3rd of last year. Those went into effect on August 19th, and we issued curtailment orders on August 20th. Since the issuance of the curtailment orders in August of last year, we've issued weekly or more frequent curtailment status updates via our website and email distribution. We've also made several updates to the water unavailability methodology, including holding 3 workshops in October, December, and May to receive public input, and issued subsequent refinements to the water unavailability methodology. Related to the emergency regulation text, we issued proposed revisions to that text and the water unavailability methodology on June 27th. We then released minor corrections to the proposed emergency regulations for readoption on July 6th. Lastly, I'll just mention there was also a meeting not necessarily related to the emergency regulations that the Delta Water Master held on July 14th to discuss water unavailability issues in the legal delta, as well as a related complaint. Next slide, please. This slide provides a brief overview of ongoing drought conditions and curtailments. As I think you're aware, despite large precipitation events that we had in the fall of 2021 and early winter, the Delta watershed experienced record dry conditions in the beginning of the year from January through March. We did get some additional precipitation in the late spring, but that precipitation and the associated runoff was not adequate to pull us out of drought, and we're currently experiencing a 3rd consecutive year of drought, with most of the Delta watershed categorized as being in severe or extreme drought at this time. Related to the dry conditions this spring, we also received a temporary urgency change petition from the Department of Water Resources and Bureau of Reclamation, requesting modifications to Delta flow and water quality requirements due to their inability to meet those requirements and other obligations. That temporary urgency change petition was approved on April 4th and was effective through June. Related to the curtailments, we, due to the late spring precipitation that we received, we did have a lull in curtailments in the early spring. Those with significant curtailments going back into effect in the San Joaquin River watershed in June of this year, and significant additional curtailments in the Sacramento River watershed and the legal delta starting in July. With that, I will now turn it over to Riley to provide an overview of the emergency regulation.
Thank you, Diane. Chair Esquivel, members of the board, good morning. My name is Riley Nolan. I'm a water resource control engineer in the Division of Water Rights Drought Planning Unit. My portion of today's presentation will be focused on the emergency regulation for the Delta Watershed, starting with an overview of the regulation and its purpose, before moving on to the proposed revisions to the emergency regulation and concluding with written comments received on the regulation in advance of today's board meeting. So to start off with an overview of the emergency regulation. At a high level, the emergency regulation authorizes the Deputy Director for the Division of Water Rights to curtail diversions when water is unavailable at a priority of right. These curtailments are necessary to administer the water rights priority system and to protect senior water right holders and claimants, to protect releases of previously stored water needed to meet water quality, temperature, and flow obligations, and to preserve critical carryover storage for minimum human health and safety needs in the event of continued drought conditions next year. These curtailments are determined by the water unavailability methodology for the Delta Watershed or a comparable tool. As was mentioned earlier, division staff continue to seek stakeholder input and feedback on the methodology and continue to make refinements. Staff have held a number of public workshops to date in order to seek that feedback on both the methodology and the regulation. Later in the presentation, my colleague Jesse Jankowski will go into greater detail on the methodology and past and future refinements. Additionally, the emergency regulation allows for enhanced reporting of projected demands and prior diversions for larger water right holders and claimants in the watershed, those with a face value or recent annual reported diversions of 1,000 acre feet or more. The emergency regulation also includes exceptions to curtailment for minimum human health and safety needs and for non-consumptive uses. And it outlines the criteria for alternative water sharing agreements that achieve the same purpose of curtailments. Next slide, please. So moving on to the proposed updates to the emergency regulation. Staff have proposed several largely minor revisions to the emergency regulation aimed at streamlining administration of the regulation and the water unavailability methodology and to provide increased stakeholder flexibility. These minor changes include the integration of self-reported water diversion data from recent years and from water master reports to be considered when assessing water right demand projections. And it includes the elimination of the ranking of supply data sources between daily full natural flow forecasts from the California Department of Water Resources Bulletin 120 and the California Nevada River Forecast Center. Next slide, please. These minor revisions also include the elimination of a deadline for submission of priority date corrections and proposals that curtailment is inappropriate. So that's along the lines of increased stakeholder flexibility. It includes clarifying language regarding the submission of jointly developed alternative water sharing agreements. And the revisions include an incorporation of an updated version of the water unavailability methodology that was released on June 27th. Next slide, please. So in addition to the minor changes just described, the revised emergency regulation includes a proposed subdivision that would provide for not reducing Sacramento River settlement contractor and Feather River contractor demands based on a reduction in contract supplies. This reduction in contract supplies resulted from an operations plan for the Central Valley Project and State Water Project that was necessary to address dry hydrologic conditions and is designed to protect cold water pools for salmon and steelhead, to improve water quality, to protect carryover storage, and to ensure minimum human health and safety supplies. The proposed subdivision allows for the use of previously reported diversions in the methodology's demand data set for the purpose of determining curtailments in the Delta watershed. Next slide, please. And continuing on the new proposed subdivision D8 to section 876.1, this provision finds that it would be unreasonable for junior water right holders or claimants to divert water that's projected to be unused under water rights and claims held by the Sacramento River settlement contractors and the Feather River contractors under the stated conditions, and that the protection of this water is needed to remain in stream in order to, as I mentioned earlier, protect cold water pools, protect carryover storage, improve water quality, and protect health and safety water supplies. Next slide, please. The slide contains a list of the entities that submitted written comments in advance of today's board meeting on the emergency regulation. I'll note that the entities listed on the slide are these entities are limited to comments on the emergency regulation. They may have also submitted comments on the methodology, but I will just be covering comments on the regulation. Next slide, please. Comments on the proposed emergency regulation include general support for readoption of the emergency regulation. Bureau of Reclamation, Westlands Water District, and San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority voiced their support for the readoption of the emergency regulation. We also received a comment from the Bureau of Reclamation requesting for a specific change to the regulation to allow for the reliance of existing contracts and agreements that achieve the purposes of curtailments in lieu of curtailments. We received comments ranging from opposition to and support for the proposed emergency regulation subdivision to protect foregone diversions by the Sacramento River settlement contractors and Feather River contractors, as discussed earlier, that are part of the drought-related operations plan for the Central Valley Project and State Water Project. Spilletta Law, representing several irrigation districts, voiced opposition to this proposed subdivision, and the Sacramento River settlement contractors voiced their support. We also received a comment letter from the City of Antioch requesting a specific exception to curtailment for desalination. The City of Antioch is in the process of constructing a brackish water desalination plant, and we've been in contact with them regarding an exception to curtailment under an existing regulatory mechanism. So to elaborate on that, staff are not suggesting any changes to the emergency regulation at this time. The current and proposed regulation includes flexibility to allow for voluntary water sharing agreements for the consideration that curtailment may not be appropriate, and for human health and safety exceptions to curtailment. These provisions allow for the consideration of existing contracts and agreements that achieve the same purposes of curtailment, and provide for the consideration of possible curtailment exceptions for desalination. Staff also continue to recommend, finding that it would be unreasonable for junior water right holders and claimants to divert water foregone by the Sacramento River settlement contractors and Feather River contractors under their water rights and claims in order, as I mentioned earlier, to preserve critical carryover storage, protect cold water pools, meet health and safety needs, and to protect water quality. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Jesse Jankowski, to cover the water unavailability methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. Good morning, Chair Esquivel and board members. My name is Jesse Jankowski, and I'm a senior water resource control engineer in the division's drought planning, hearings, and special projects section. I'll provide an overview of the water unavailability methodology for the Delta Watershed, its recent refinements, and comments received regarding it. As a brief review, the methodology is an approach integrating supply and demand information to evaluate water unavailability for purposes of water right curtailments in the Delta Watershed under the emergency regulation. The methodology uses public data and technical and legal assumptions in order to determine whether natural or abandoned flows are available for water right holders and claimants to divert based on their diversion locations and the priority dates of their rights or claims. The methodology applies only to surface water diversions and not to rediversions of previously stored water, contracts, transfers, or groundwater use. At its core, the methodology is a comparison of water supply and demand using supply forecasts published by other agencies and available demand information reported by water users. This includes reports submitted between 2018 and 2021, as well as projected demands provided by water users pursuant to the regulation. The methodology performs these analyses at multiple spatial scales to evaluate conditions for nearly 17,000 water rights and claims throughout the watershed. It does this in headwater tributary subwatersheds, the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds as a whole, and in the legal delta, where supplies from both watersheds contribute to meet demands. Any legal delta curtailments are always made in consultation with and with the concurrence of the Delta Water Master. On this slide is an example of one such comparison for the Sacramento River watershed. Forecasted supply is less than demand, resulting in curtailments of junior water right demands above the orange supply line. Next slide, please. So the methodology has been updated several times since its initial draft release in May 2021, and the latest June 27th version includes a number of refinements to improve its inputs and analyses. The methodology disaggregates demands for direct diversions and diversions to storage, with these demands spatially distributed based on specific types of diversion points, like storage reservoirs. Return flows are also not applied to demands for diversions to storage because they do not produce return flows until water is released and diverted for consumptive use. Since February, the methodology only curtails a water right or claim if zero supply is available to it. So in other words, water rights will not be curtailed if some portion of their demand can be met by available supply. This summer, return flow factors that are representative of critically dry conditions were applied to account for reduced irrigated agricultural plantings this year. In the June revision, return flows are also applied to all water rights and all subwatersheds, not just on the valley floor, as was the case previously. Most of the water rights associated with the Central Valley and state water projects in the Sacramento watershed and the legal delta are assumed to have the most junior priority in the methodology due to area of origin protections. And in recognition of the project's coordinated operation agreement, these project rights will only be curtailed when water is unavailable to all of them. Finally, a number of specific adjustments were made to certain water rights and claims. These included reductions to Sacramento River settlement and Feather River contractors prior to the proposed emergency regulation provision included in section 876.1 subdivision D8. The addition of demands by the San Joaquin River exchange contractors for San Joaquin River water from April through June this year, and reductions to project demands in the legal delta in May and June of this year associated with the executive director's order limiting exports from the delta as a condition of approval of the project's temporary urgency change petition. Next slide, please. Additional refinements are anticipated this summer, including refinements to further address comments received on the methodology. Return flow factors for the Sacramento watershed, which typically result in a larger reduction in demand due to rice field drainage in the late summer, will be adjusted this year to account for reduced plantings. Staff will work to provide more advanced notice of expected curtailments during the dry season, but projections during the wet season may be less appropriate due to the dynamic nature of hydrologic conditions and the need to make curtailment decisions using the best available information. Finally, an enhanced version of the watershed analysis is in development, which incorporates better spatial resolution of the connectivity of supply and demand on individual tributaries in the watershed. An updated methodology reflecting these changes is expected in the next several months, along with an opportunity for public input on it. Next slide, please. Appendix D is a portion of the methodology's public documentation, which addresses its application in the legal delta and questions regarding residence time and water availability there. Appendix D was originally released in August 2021 and looked at the issue in 3 different ways. First, it assessed the large tidal fluxes in different regions of the legal delta. Second, it compared consumptive water use estimated by the Department of Water Resources in those regions to channel volumes in those regions as estimated by the U.S. Geological Survey. Third, it contained estimates of delta inflows in summer 2021, absent releases and deliveries of previously stored project water. And finally, it explored the effects of these factors on water quality. The methods used in Appendix D's initial release used data on observed stream flows and exports and required assumptions about upstream project deliveries that likely overestimated the natural and abandoned inflow to the legal delta. Next slide, please. So along with the other methodology refinements, an updated version of Appendix D was released on June 27th. It largely takes the same approach as in 2021, but incorporates some minor clarifications in response to questions from water users. This includes a better description of the applicability of DWR's updated Delta Simulation Model, or DSM-2, to determine water unavailability in the legal delta. While several commenters have suggested that the board use DSM-2 for curtailment purposes, no recommendations for how to use DSM-2 in curtailment decisions have been received. Given that DSM-2 results vary throughout the delta and are based on a 15-minute time interval, it's not clear how such results should be used in curtailments, nor whether doing so would be appropriate. The updated appendix also clarifies how tidal flux does not reduce legal delta residence time to the order of days. However, the large tidal flux compared to channel volumes does have the effect of reducing the amount of time some particles stay in the legal delta. The primary update to Appendix D was the use of water supply and demand data that are consistent with the rest of the methodology, which may provide a more accurate estimate of natural and abandoned legal delta inflow. This includes forecasted supplies that are available at the priority of legal delta users, consumptive use by legal delta rights and claims, and calculations of subsequent delta outflows. Absent any curtailment of legal delta rights and claims, these calculated outflows would be negative in July through September 2022. Given the low natural and abandoned inflows to the legal delta this summer, consumptive use by diversions there, and the relatively low channel volumes, especially in the southern delta, Appendix D demonstrates that the assumptions and conclusions in the methodology are appropriate for the methodology's use as a drought emergency tool in the legal delta. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a question on this?
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the concerns that have been raised by some that using estimates on, well, you have here consumptive use, but I'm thinking also of demands and reports that they may be overstated. How do you address that issue in the methodology?
Yeah, we do have a number of provisions for both quality controlling the demand information we receive, as well as for enhanced reporting to improve the accuracy of that. And that's actually on the next slide, if you want to listen to that. Great. Thank you. So the enhanced reporting provision was established to provide current real-time demand data that can be used alongside the methodology to determine water unavailability. The enhanced reporting provision has required the largest water users, representing approximately 90% of water diverted in the watershed, to submit prior diversion data and projections of demands every month. Currently, this applies to users diverting 5,000 acre-feet or more annually. So in response to comments received about the methodology's demand assumptions, and in an effort to ensure the most representative data set is used to determine curtailments while reducing the burden of reporting, staff is planning to modify the enhanced reporting approach in several ways for the readoption of the regulation. First, diverters will be asked to provide projections of demands only if they determine that monthly demands assumed in the methodology require updating. So hopefully this addresses your question, Vice Chair. The updated demand values submitted by diverters would then be incorporated into the methodology and used to determine curtailments after quality control and assurance of that information. So this is replacement of the existing assumed 2018 or other demands with up-to-date accurate information submitted by water users. So although no regulation changes are needed to carry this out, staff also intend to expand enhanced reporting to include rights and claims with a face value of 1,000 acre-feet annually or greater. That's expanding from 5,000 acre-feet annually or greater currently. So although diversions greater than 5,000 acre-feet represent about 90% of water diverted within the Delta watershed, diversions between 1 and 5,000 acre-feet could still have an effect on demands that determine curtailments, especially at the local subwatershed scale. These diverters will similarly be asked to provide projections of demands only if they determine that monthly demands assumed in the methodology require updating. So we do have a planned way to present that demand information that we currently assume in a very usable format, similar to the way that we currently communicate curtailment statuses. And in addition to refinements to the reporting provisions, we plan to conduct additional quality control of the demand data that we're using from 2018. And we plan to expand this down to 1,000 acre-feet per year as well. So we're quality controlling a much larger set of data to ensure that's representative of demands for natural flow. And the division continues to strive towards producing a more representative demand data set, which necessitates current real-time information that the enhanced reporting provision is intended to make available. Expanding the number of diverters asked to provide enhanced reporting of projected demands will provide more data, while those modifications to the reporting requirements will ease the burden of reporting. And overall, that's expected to increase reporting numbers, compliance rates, and provide for more usable data. Additional modifications to the enhanced reporting provisions may also be considered as appropriate in the future. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll review the comments that were received regarding the methodology. Although comments were only solicited on Appendix D, a number were received that addressed other aspects of the methodology, so we'll discuss them. And commenters include some that Riley previously mentioned, as well as additional public agencies and irrigation districts listed here. Next slide, please. So there were a few trends among the comments received, with some issues raised in multiple comments. Generally, there were requests to further refine the demand data, as we've talked about a little bit already. That's used in the methodology. And as I discussed, the enhanced reporting and quality control expansions are specifically intended to address these concerns. Some commenters requested more advanced notice of curtailments. And as I talked about, staff do plan to provide more advanced notice of expected curtailments during the dry season. We'll also investigate possible appropriate wet season advance notice of curtailments, though there are trade-offs in advance notice versus the use of most up-to-date available supply forecasts. Multiple comments expressed concern that the watershed-wide analysis, which aggregates supply and demand, doesn't accurately represent watershed connectivity. And the enhanced watershed analysis that I mentioned, planned for rollout later this year, and other longer-term planned improvements to the methodology may help to improve the spatial granularity of the analysis. It was requested that the division provide public notifications of all adjustments made to the methodology's input data. The data and the analyses used to determine curtailments are already posted on the board's publicly accessible file transfer protocol site, or FTP, every week, and weekly update emails issued to our distribution list describe the core assumptions that inform all curtailment updates. Stakeholders are welcome to contact the division to obtain login credentials to download these data sets, and we're happily available to address specific questions about the methodology's assumptions with stakeholders. Some questions were raised about the potential undercounting of return flows that result from rediversions of storage releases or groundwater use. Though previous comments received and data observed at limited available sites have alternatively suggested that the methodology may overestimate return flows in a critically dry year such as this. At this time, the methodology uses the best available wide-scale information to apply return flows in direct proportion to demands across the watershed. and we continue to explore opportunities to improve these assumptions moving forward. Finally, multiple commenters stated that Appendix D insufficiently addresses hydrodynamics in legal delta. And as I discussed previously, no suggestions were provided on how to use DSM-2 for the purpose of curtailments. As appropriate, Appendix D and other parts of the methodology can be updated in the future. From there, I will turn it back to Diane to conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. So I'll provide an overview of the timeline for the emergency regulation approval process and implementation process. As a reminder, the rulemaking process is established by the California Administrative Procedures Act. For emergency regulations, the normal rulemaking process is simplified and generally includes a brief public notice period, a brief public comment period, review by the Office of Administrative Law, and an approval decision by the Office of Administrative Law. We anticipate issuing the notice of proposed rulemaking this week or early next week if the board adopts the proposed emergency regulation today. We plan on submitting the emergency regulation file to the Office of Administrative Law no sooner than 5 working days after this notice has been issued. After the emergency regulation package has been submitted, the Office of Administrative Law then has 10 calendar days in which to review and make a decision on the proposed emergency rulemaking. During the 10-day period, OAL posts the notice of emergency action on its website, which starts a 5 calendar day comment period. After the comment period ends, the Office of Administrative Law has the remainder of the 10 calendar days to approve or disapprove the emergency regulation. If the Office of Administrative Law approves the emergency regulation, the office will file the approved regulation with the Secretary of State, and the regulation will become effective. Based on the proposed schedule, the regulation would become effective in early to mid-August and remain in effect for up to 1 year. Next slide, please. And just before we conclude the staff presentation, we wanted to remind interested parties of some of our available resources and ways that they can contact board staff and stay informed. Any questions can be sent via email to the board's email address at bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov or via the Delta Drought phone line listed on this slide. We also strongly recommend that parties subscribe to our Delta Drought email distribution list if they haven't done so already. You can sign up for the email list by providing your email in the subscription box that's shown on the slide, which can be found on the bottom of the Delta Drought webpage. Information on water unavailability and related curtailment information in the Delta Watershed will be distributed via this email distribution list, as well as posted on the board's Drought website. With that concludes the staff presentation. We're happy to take any additional questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Riddle. Really appreciate you and the team's just incredible work, continual incredible work, but especially over the last year on this regulation. I want to just acknowledge and appreciate as well that what we have before the board is readoption of the regulation and reporting requirements, and what's separated is the methodology. And really do appreciate that those two are separate here, and that it doesn't require coming back to the board and for readoption to continually iterate and update that methodology, which this last year we saw was really critical, given that this is the first time we're doing this in California's history, to this scale, this scope, this complexity. And what we find is there's a lot that we need to still unpack. There's a lot of questions that certainly arise as we administer the water rights system for the first time again. But I'm just incredibly proud with the effort and how far we've come on the methodology, on the reg and the work, and really glad to hear and looking forward to this update that we'll be able to have of the methodology in August in these next months. And here importantly, it gives us that better spatial resolution and has greater connectivity. It continues to move us forward, and we can do so throughout the year without having to come back to the board. So I appreciate that those two are separate. I appreciate that there's a lot of work and still questions, but a lot of engagement happening with water right holders in the system for the first time in a way that I think is empowering us all to figure out how we do better. And although, and important to remember, these are emergency regulations. And what is on the back end of it is a lot of work that has not been done for decades. And so we're doing our best. We're having to simplify a complex system by its nature. But I think, I know we're very much headed toward a more real-time system to better connect the drops, better connect our understanding of even one's real right to divert at any given moment in a way that will really has benefits to us, certainly in this emergency as we try to manage through unprecedented conditions, but as well as we make decisions around storage projects or around the future of what our landscape is going to look like in a way that can be better informed by water rights and better rest on what should be one of our strongest tools to actually combat climate change. So all that to be said, I really do appreciate where we are on this. I don't have any huge grave misgivings. I want to hear what others have to still say yet, though, and hear what other board colleagues have to say. But everywhere I seem to go recently, I get a lot of condolences around the difficulty of the job that certainly we have or whatnot, and it is nowhere near the difficulty of the job that you all have. Working in these complexities in ways that we just depend on your technical expertise in incredible ways. So just thank you, appreciate it, and actually look to my fellow board colleagues. What we'll have is just please do highlight any issues here at first. We'll go to commenters after we take a break, and then certainly we'll respond as we always do to what we further hear at that moment. But do take this moment as board members to flag anything that we could, our folks can take benefit of over the break to think of. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And I concur with your comments of, thanks to staff, but and also to the stakeholders. This has been an amazing time of just increased dialogue and more openness, toned down emotions, more focus on the methodology, and the conversations oftentimes get so technical that I don't really understand it, but I'm just pleased to see the conversations going on. So thank you all and the broader stakeholder community for that. So I think for me, it's just interesting that I always, even though I've just recently been briefed, I always have more questions. And so bear with me in a couple of areas here. First of all, on the further refinements for the methodology, could you talk a little bit about where you see the distinction between sort of technical issues, adjustments to the methodology versus the openness and the need for ongoing discussions for maybe the more challenging issues like residence time, DSM2, and what sort of opportunities do you see presenting to stakeholders to further engage in those important topics?
That's a very good question. I would say that most of the issues have a bit of both technical components to them as well as a policy legal component to them. The decision related to simplifying a very complex system, is a policy call, I think, in many parts, and whether we've overly simplified it or we don't need to simplify it further, I think ultimately becomes a policy call. As Jesse explained, we are working very hard to try to increase the resolution of our model and make it as accurate as possible and as real time as possible. However, there will always be complexities that we have to contend with in a very dynamic and complex and large watershed like the Delta watershed. So there will always be some need for providing for reasonable simplifying assumptions. And we've been doing that through the public process. We are all ears for any ideas that folks have on how we can make feasible improvements, both in the short term and the long term. So we're absolutely interested in that type of information. and have had a lot of conversations on that front. We also, I'll mention the emergency regulation. We've got the methodology. We also have provisions in the emergency regulation that allow for flexibility where appropriate. And there have been a couple of ways that the public input that we received has played out. It's played out in updates to the methodology. It's also played out in us considering specific circumstances for specific water right holders when they submit an exception request, whether it be for a voluntary water sharing agreement, a health and safety exception, or another exception. We can look at the very specific circumstances of that water right holder and the watershed through the tools that are available in the regulation. So that's also been a valuable tool, a valuable opportunity for us to take a deeper look at specific conditions within a watershed and consider those conditions as we implement the methodology. So there's, kind of three different levels. There's the regulation, the flexibility that it gives us, the methodology that provides the basis for how we implement the curtailments, the flexibility that exists there, and then the real-time coordination that we're doing on the implementation front. So I think all three of those work together, and they all have a policy component and certainly a very large technical component to them.
Okay, and then on the comment from the Bureau of Reclamation about using the contract provisions, want to hear a little bit more about that. And do you see, if you didn't address it, do you see that maybe morphing into an opportunity for a voluntary agreement or some adjustment at a later time? And if so, this just reminds me of how the SAC settlement contractors issue sort of played out, and looking for sort of that balance between individualized conversations that stakeholders may have with you all, and at what opportunity and commitment can you make to daylight, at the appropriate time.
Yeah, certainly. So we got a comment from the Bureau of Reclamation requesting that the regulation provide a specific provision for considering local or regional contractual and other voluntary arrangements. I think our general response to that is that the regulation, through the provisions that I just spoke about, the flexibility that exists in the regulation already provides those opportunities. We have, again, the opportunities for voluntary water sharing agreements, and we also have the possibility for exceptions where curtailment may not be appropriate because of the specific conditions within a watershed. So those are tools that are available to Reclamation. In addition to submitting their comments related to the regulation, they also submitted a request that curtailment is not appropriate. We've taken a look at that request. We provided a response just late last night, so I don't expect that Reclamation's had the chance to take a look at it yet. But there are a couple of things that we need to balance. I think we want to be as reasonable as possible and utilize local cooperative agreements where they exist or where they're possible. But we also need to make sure that we're implementing the regulation in a way that's fair and consistent across the watershed. And that's the look that we're taking. And the tool that Jesse's been developing that has a finer spatial resolution is one way that we've started to do that. We need to continue to develop that tool, but we can use it now in these curtailment exceptions to take a look at, would providing an exception affect other water right holders? Could it be appropriate? So we're also doing that. We recently considered a request that curtailment's not appropriate on that basis from Oakdale and South San Joaquin irrigation district. So we are, again, there are these various levels that we're looking at the issues from, and that is a valuable tool for us, I think, and it's a usable tool, and we've been using it since we implemented the emergency regulation. So I think that's the appropriate mechanism for addressing the type of comments that Reclamation had.
Okay, thank you for that. And then last question has to do with the legal delta. And I believe I heard Mr. Jankowski, you say, and I tried to take notes here, that there's an assumption in the methodology that these are senior rights. And I think I heard you say because of area of origin. And just want to make sure that I got that right. I kind of see those as being two different issues. And so just want to give you an opportunity to further explain.
My apologies. I may have misspoke. These are referring to the project rights in the legal delta and elsewhere. And those are assumed to have junior priority, junior to all other water rights due to area of origin protections.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Other colleagues at this moment with comments? Okay, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and then that'll bring us refreshed to come in to hear about 8 commenters I think that we have, and then further board discussion. So I don't know, that brings us around 11:25, and so we'll come back then. Thank you. Okay, everyone, we're at 11:25. I think we can gather back. We can begin to get through our commenters. And first, I'd like to call up Dante John Namalini, who will be followed by Tim Visvasky. Apologies. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, and you may need to turn on the mic, actually, Mr. Namalini.
All right, I'm Dante John Namalini. I'm the manager and co-counsel for the Central Delta Water Agency. First, I recognize the significance of the task that you're trying to undertake and the staff is trying to undertake. I suffer from the problem of having a history and some familiarity with the law that I think the younger generation lacks entirely. Now, first, let's talk about the procedure. Your notice called for comment on Appendix D, but stated it's not comment on the regulation. Now, I submitted my comments in a broad form that not only addressed the regulation, but Appendix D. And then one of the earlier slides didn't list my comment as being appropriate on the regulation itself. Secondly, late in the notice process was a red line put out with regard to a change in your regulation. We did not have an opportunity to comment on that red line, and I'm not sure I understand the effect of it. The third thing I want to mention is data availability. With regard to general availability that I've relied on for years to try and verify data that's coming basically a lot of it from Department of Water Resources that's an adversary to us in many proceedings. So we have the fox in the chicken house in our view, and we look to historical data to confirm and try and test this. Well, ADA requirements have precluded easy access to that data. And then the reference to your data. I tried to go to those source documents. I recommend you try and go to them, but it's very difficult. They're not in PDF form. They're hard to download, hard to get through it. So I wasn't able to do what I would normally try and do as a more detailed technical analysis. The flexibility that's been professed here with regard to curtailment, you are adopting in a regulation that provides that any violation of what's in the regulation constitutes an unreasonable use of water under the Constitution. So all this variability in here leads to a due process problem for us. Curtailment without due process. Adjudicatory hearing, we need one. We need certainty, more certainty in the regulation. If you want to take the water availability analysis out of the regulation, that might be a way to do it. My suggestion is to take the changes to Appendix D out of this regulation, because I think they are clearly against the physical reality of what's in the Delta. And I've produced some slides. I've been criticized for having too much paper. Nobody can read it, and I think nobody has read it. But let's go to the next slide here. Now, the state Department of Water Resources has recognized for years the clear physical reality of the Delta and has verified that quantity is not an issue in the Delta tidal zone. And they've memorialized that in this study. And if you don't have the study now that the ADA has kept it off the easy index list, I can provide it to you. Secondly, let's go to the next slide. Well, I think there's one in between. But anyway, this slide shows that in 1931, when the most serious intrusion of salinity into the Delta occurred, there was good water quality in the South Delta at Mossdale and Durham Ferry Bridge, very good quality. And these analysis that we have that are coming out of your water availability thing says there's no water. Something's wrong there. That needs to be clarified in some respect. We've presented this before. It's an issue for us, indicating something is dramatically wrong with what's being presented in water availability, whether it's preclusion of consideration of water above frying or something's going on that is inconsistent with the historical measurement that is available to us. So let's go to the next one. The Department of Water Resources and the North Delta Water Agency contract memorializes this agreed upon, well understood situation that there's no physical shortage of water in the Delta. This is in the contract. It's memorialized there. It's memorialized in that study. Yet we find today, with a new fresh look with these young people, that they're ignoring this fact. Now, what happens with this fact? There may not be curtailment in the Delta for many other reasons besides this, but then this is used to create demand that then applies to other water right holders in the system and triggers a curtailment prematurely based on an analysis that assumes that there is a shortage in the Delta that needs to be made up by the upstream water right holders. So there's a problem in that. And I would think that enforceability that's based on any shortage with an allocation coming from a conclusion that there is a physical shortage of water in the Delta is going to be fatally flawed and fall if challenged. Now let's go to the next slide. It's clear, not only in prior board decisions, but in the courts, that the first priority is for meeting water quality standards and needs in the Delta. And export for any other use is secondary. Now, what you've done in your general regulation, and I've been told not to emphasize it, but I'm going to tell you what I see as the problem. Much of the justification for export is health and safety. Now, health and safety in a very general way, just thousands of cubic feet per second going down the aqueduct, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a health and safety issue where that water is being used. And we have ample programs, some of which you administer, that are effective at getting at some community that doesn't have a water supply. Some are not even connected to the system that we're fighting over. And therefore, those need to be addressed otherwise. Now, I'm familiar with some water deliveries, in the South Bay area. There's a big demand for warehouses to grow marijuana. Is that a need that we have to have health and safety water that free up water for that purpose? In other words, you're not segregating what that health and safety issue is. Now, I understand we need to have some flexibility for a soft landing in a system that's bankrupt of water. I understand that. But these various legal principles are important to us in terms of trying to right this ship and get headed on the right course down the road. Now, we have advocated to the board and to the department and the Bureau that they set forth a plan as to how they would meet water quality standards. So this has been a complaint from us for quite a while. And the reason is that you have to plan, they're planning for forecasted events. The forecasting has a probability associated with it. The forecasting ought to be to take one of the experiences of the past, which the planners of the project did with the 28 through 34 drought, and they planned around that to determine what firm yield the project would have and so forth. By doing that, you would put into perspective, and your board has the unique opportunity to do that, to put before our policymakers the great extent that we lack supply to meet demand. What happens in this process is that we just keep things going. And let's take the governor's office. I don't think he knows that we're short like 8 million acre feet. You know, that we don't even know where we get it, or 5 million acre feet. Somebody's got to put this thing in perspective. Now, you may not act on it. Now, when I looked at emergency declarations in the past, and I haven't been able to look at the detail of some of the current ones, that had the water not been exported, that water could have been used to meet the standards. And part of that comes from using your forecasting, because commitments of water occur in the months January and February and March before we know what that rainy season really is. So the water that we needed to meet water quality standards already went out the door. And you can see that in this process. And I've documented it in comments to you with regard to the prior droughts, which I looked at carefully. And a repetition of emergency declaration after emergency declaration should tell us all that we need to get at the basic issue here. And what we're doing is struggling. We're fighting over a diversion in the Delta or somebody's water right here and there. None of that is going to correct the course of action with this major shortage that we have in the state. So I would ask that you guys look at that. Now, the law required that the projects, let's go to another slide here.
Just to flag, Mr. Nomalini, you've had about 10 minutes at this point, and so
okay. Let me just show you where there's been law already requiring that there be a plan to meet the water quality standards. Go to the next slide. Keep going. Keep going. This is the one that says you got to stop exporting water if you don't meet salinity requirements. Anyway, keep going. It's 138.10 of the water code that required that the department come up with a plan to meet the water quality standards and submit it. Now, if they did come up with it, I haven't looked at it, but it was back at CalFed, but it didn't work because they're not meeting the standards now. So it doesn't work. The second thing is I participated in federal legislation. Unbelievable. Birmingham and I had to agree on the language. But it required the governor and the Secretary of Interior, this is federal law, to develop a plan to meet all the water quality requirements of the state. And they couldn't go forward with any increased exports or use of the intertie. Now, that didn't occur. There still hasn't been a compliance. And I would ask that you people think about what I'm telling you and use your influence, and just covering up the ball all the time here for the politicians that won't make hard decisions, and put on the table the reality of this shortage of water. Now, what we in the Delta have done, we're working with Met and we're trying to keep the Delta levees from failing. If we had a failure today of a Western Delta levee or an interior levee with this drought condition, we would have an absolute disaster in the water field. Now, nobody pays any attention to that but us. And they take, DWR takes Delta levee money and goes and builds a habitat project over in the bypass. But somebody has to sober this process up. And unfortunately, my voice is not strong enough to get some sober in this process, but you people may have the power to do it. So thank you very much. And I realize it. I went beyond my time. All right.
More than fine, Mr. Nomalini, and I appreciate your comments here and continued advocacy for issues certainly in the Delta. And to your point, although these are emergency consideration of regulations and issues in curtailment, there is a lot of long-standing need, certainly, and being honest and sobering about our reality is one of them as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Tim Wachewski. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, Chair Esquivel. Tim Wachewski for the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. It's been about a year since we last provided comments on the board's curtailment regulations. And at that time, we identified a lot of legal issues that we had with the regs. We asked the board not to adopt them for those reasons. We saw due process violations. We saw the board was exceeding its limited authority over pre-1914 rights. We saw an unlawful delegation of authority to the deputy director. We saw problems with the methodology, the potential for violations of the rural water right priority, and I could keep going. But 1 year later, none of those issues have been resolved, and this new regulation doesn't resolve them either. So we renew all of those old objections, and we ask you not to readopt the regulations on those same grounds. But I'm not going to belabor all those points today. You've heard them, you've read them. And I don't think that we're going to find common ground in the final hour here. Instead, what I want to focus on is some transparency issues. First, I want to say that the SJTA appreciates this board's dedication to transparency. We believe it's very important, and I think that the board shares that belief. And with that said, in the context of this curtailment regulation, I think that there is some room for improvement, and we have several suggestions. First, regarding the summary reports that come out, we want an opportunity to comment on changes to the methodology, and we want to see redline versions of the summary reports that describe the changes to the methodology each time. These regulations are about a year old now, and since that time, since they were first adopted, I think we've seen 6 different summary reports since the first adoption. Some of the appendices have been modified even more times than that, and we have never once been provided with a single redline version of the appendix or the summary report. I know that there's been workshops, and we appreciate those, but those have not occurred before every change to the summary report or to the appendices or to the spreadsheet for that matter. I do want to point out that we think changing the methodology on the fly in the way that the board is doing without providing an opportunity to be heard by water users who could be impacted by those changes is a due process violation. I don't really think you can rectify that with the setup that you have or with workshops. The factual determinations that are being made each time a change is made to the methodology or each time the methodology is tweaked can be incredibly wide-reaching and would require a hearing with thousands of water users who are impacted being present. Now, I would encourage you to hold that hearing, but I don't think you're going to do it. So at the very least, what I think you can do is provide the public with a redline version of the summary reports. Give us an opportunity to comment on the changes before they're accepted, or excuse me, put into effect. I do not think this resolves the due process issues, but it's better than the current approach. With regard to the spreadsheet, we ask that you provide written explanations to the public each time the spreadsheet is changed. There are at least 9 different versions of the spreadsheet listed on the board's website right now since the time of adoption. There may be more variations that exist between those 9 different versions. We do appreciate that the board makes the spreadsheets available to the public. I urge you to continue doing that, but it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to identify all of the changes that are made from week to week on those spreadsheets. I'm sure you've seen the spreadsheet is massive. There are hundreds of thousands of entries. There are multiple tabs with formulas that cross-reference from tab to tab. A lot of the public probably cannot even understand the formulas that are built into it. That's why we think it's important to provide an explanation as to what the changes are, in addition to providing the spreadsheet each time it's made. Ideally, we would also have an opportunity to comment before those changes are put into effect. Again, I don't think this satisfies the due process issue with respect to, how each one of those changes impacts other water users. But again, it's better than the current approach, and we think it's a start. So there have also been what seems to be undisclosed changes or private curtailment exemptions that happen occasionally. Some of our members received a decision yesterday approving a request to correct an inappropriate curtailment. There was a reference to that earlier by Ms. Riddle. Oakdale and South San Joaquin Irrigation District identified an issue with the watershed-wide approach, where, as you know, there were completely disconnected tributaries where the supply on one was being aggregated with the supply on the other, and curtailments were being issued in a way that did not make water available to other parties on those disconnected tributaries. I understand that problem's being corrected, at least partially, presumably with yet another version of the spreadsheet. But I will also note that Oakdale and South San Joaquin have not seen a change yet to their curtailment status on the board's webpage. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but we can follow up separately with staff. That's not really the point. The point is that we're aware of this change, but I don't think the general public is aware of the change. I also heard a reference to Reclamation also submitting a similar request for an inappropriate curtailment today. I'm not aware of that happening. I'm not aware of any decision being issued on it. That's just something we would like to see made public in the interest of full transparency of what's happening. So those are some of the issues or the areas where we think the board can improve with respect to transparency. I know that there is a strong desire by the board and staff to be nimble in this process, and I appreciate that, but I don't think that that can come at the expense of transparency as to what's happening behind the scenes. So I thank you for the opportunity to comment. I hope that we'll see some of those changes put into effect while we fight out the much larger issues in court. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments. And while we obviously have some fundamental disagreements on our authorities and work here, appreciate the recommendations on transparency and openness. As you said, it is a huge passion and real priority of mine, especially in this complex decision making, and it's definitely that balance. Anything to comment on, Ms. Riddle? On I think that I know there were a number of recommendations in there. I'll even say I heard something like due process insofar as an engagement, a response. Anyway. So by all means.
Yes, thank you. I did want to note that we do post all of the exception requests that we receive on our FTP site. And so I believe that Mr. Wachowski and others have access to that site. I recognize, there may be more, we could possibly, as we get these, send out emails as well. We have gotten a lot of exception requests, particularly the health and safety exception requests. So we haven't wanted to bombard people with a number of emails, but that's, a possibility if people are interested in that. But all of the material that we get in our responses are posted on our FTP site. So that information is available to the public. The exception to curtailment, I think that while we may not have updated the curtailment status list, I think that decision prevails. So for that purpose, those rights are not curtailed at this point that we determined were not curtailed. The reclamation requests we have not fully acted on. We've requested additional information, so there isn't a resolution of that matter yet. But the request is posted on our FTP site. Related to the request for a red line version of the report, that is something we can definitely consider doing. We haven't done it to date just because some of the changes are, it can get messy when you're moving paragraphs around and those kinds of things, and might look like a change that is not really a substantive change. So we have a portion in the beginning of the report in which we summarize the changes that are constitute a change to the methodology or otherwise. With respect to the changes to the spreadsheet, each week as we issue the curtailment updates, we also summarize the major updates to the spreadsheet, such as the assumptions related to the exports by the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. We include a summary of those. It is not a detailed, it doesn't include every single change. In some cases, we've identified a duplicate reporting or something like that. And we don't necessarily always identify those things. We can figure out, we can discuss a way to possibly do that. But the major changes are summarized. We've been attempting to do that and, for the spreadsheet as well as for the methodology report. The opportunity to comment before we implement a change. I'd have to go back and think through all of the changes that we've made to the methodology. Many of them cut in the favor of reducing curtailment. So there is a con to waiting on implementing changes to the methodology until after we've had a public comment period. So in that case, a lot of those changes are of that variety. There are other changes too, granted, and we can certainly consider if it is a change that could affect another water right holder, that we hold the public process before we make that change. I think that covers it. I guess going back to Dante's comments, I will also just add, since I have the opportunity, that we noticed both comments on Appendix D as well as the emergency regulation. We did issue a minor update to the emergency regulation text on July 6th. The comment period closed on July 8th, and I know that that's a very short turnaround time. The changes were pretty minor, and they were to track the, for the most part, to track the governor's drought proclamations. I don't think they were really substantive. The substance of the regulation remained the same from the first version that we put out. It was just some minor language changes in order to track better with that proclamation. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Riddle. Really appreciate the thorough response, and Mr. Wachewski for the good faith recommendations. Next, I'd like to now move on to Jean Zolezi online. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair and board members. Jean Zolezi, appearing for Bannock Carbona Irrigation District, Patterson Irrigation District, and West Stanislaus Irrigation District. I would like to incorporate the prior comments as our own as well. We retain the same objections to the methodology that we did last year when it was adopted, but because of the time limits, I want to focus today not on those objections and continuing concerns, but on the proposed change in emergency regulations, section 876.18, specifically with the demand of the Sacramento River settlement contractors. And unfortunately, this proposed language is a return to the unsuccessful methodology utilized in 2015, with inflated demand creating a skewed version of water availability, resulting in illegal curtailments. When combined with the other flaws that have been identified and which we've mentioned previously in the current methodology, the proposed language is simply a move in the wrong direction. First, the public has not been provided with sufficient information about the operations plan that is being referenced, what it does, what it's allowed to do. The public really needs to review that operations plan, see exactly what it is doing, what kind of water it is doing it with, and make sure it in itself is a legal operations plan. But most importantly, failing to reduce the demand of the Sacramento River settlement contractors when they are not exercising that demand is simply incorrect and illegal. The contractors voluntarily reduced their demand. There is no written agreement by which they agreed to do so, explaining how they agreed to do so or exactly what they agreed to forego. And the water that is not being diverted was not dedicated to the environment. Now, the proposed draft regulation says that the water is needed to remain in stream to conserve cold water pools, et cetera, et cetera. There's no documentation that it will be used for that purpose. There's no documentation that it's needed for those purposes. This is not a situation like the Scott River where your regulation documented Fish and Wildlife, and other regulatory agencies, stating specifically what was needed in a particular river segment, and that the water action is being taken to make that water available. That is not happening here. There is a legal process to be used when water is not diverted and needs to remain in stream to conserve cold water pools, improve water quality, protect carryover storage, et cetera, listed in the regulation. Water Code Section 1707 provides a method for preserving water for this purpose. And that process is not being followed here. There's a reason that process was put into law, because it set forth the findings the board must make in order to dedicate that water. Those are to protect third parties, and they include that the action will not increase the amount of water the person is entitled to use. We don't know that here about reclamation's rights. Will not unreasonably affect any legal user of water. This has not been established, and we assert that we are being unreasonably affected, and otherwise meets the requirements of this division. What a staff is proposing here is to accomplish the same ends of a 1707 petition without following the required legal procedure and without the board making the required findings. And this should not be allowed here. And specifically, we would ask you to reject that proposed change. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Alesi. I appreciate your comments. Next, I'd like to go to Jennifer Spalletta.
Good afternoon. Hopefully my video is coming up. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. I do want to join in Ms. Alesi's comments on the proposal regarding the methodology related to the exchange contractors. I want to emphasize that I think the biggest problem with this red line is a lack of transparency and detail and process. Not necessarily with the concept that there could be an arrangement there that's helpful to the system. And so we just need to have a lot more information, and it's not appropriate to do this in the manner in which it's being done, where we don't all have that information and the procedure hasn't been followed. The second thing that I want to do is make sure that you know that I still support all the other comments that have been made, particularly the technical comments of Dr. Paulson and Nick Bonsignor and Greg Young. Those comments are all still valid and have not been addressed in the methodology. By renewing the emergency regulation, you're essentially renewing the methodology and all of the aspects of it that are affecting my client's ability to divert, and we have continued objections to that. Some of those may be resolved in court, but I'm hopeful that staff and the board will continue to update the methodology and improve it as these things are brought to your attention. The one thing I want to focus on today is return flows and how they're represented in the methodology. And this is really a forest for the trees type of issue. The methodology, admittedly by staff, only focuses on the presence of natural flow or abandoned in-stream flow releases from storage. It does not attempt to address the use of stored water or the use of groundwater. And in the summer months of a dry year, the use of previously stored water for irrigation and the use of groundwater for irrigation is obviously very large, and in fact, larger than in most other year types. There are currently no return flows for either one of those very large water uses represented in your spreadsheet. However, we know that as a practical matter, the lower San Joaquin River and the Delta are dominated by return flows from the use of stored water and the use of groundwater. We're talking about very large quantities of water. So there are several 100,000 acres in the San Joaquin watershed that are currently being irrigated with stored water and with groundwater, and there are no return flows from those irrigation sources that are represented in the spreadsheet. By order of magnitude, the total pre-1914 appropriative rights for the month of July in the lower San Joaquin watershed and the Delta are less than 20,000 acre feet. By order of magnitude, the number that should be associated with the return flows from the use of stored water and the use of groundwater, just with common sense, understanding the number of acres that are irrigated and the crop demands, is significantly higher than 20,000 acre feet. So again, this is a forest for the trees issue. When we're in the driest months of summer and irrigation is continuing on these thousands of acres with different water sources, and those return flows are flowing into the lower San Joaquin River, that is precisely what the pre-1914 and most senior appropriative rights the state board has jurisdiction over were designed to capture. And they're currently being curtailed because that source of water is not represented in your methodology. So what I want to emphasize today is that by curtailing water rights based on what is in the methodology, you have water rights that are what we call on the cusp. Water rights that are getting turned on and off 1 week here, 1 week there. If you were properly including in the methodology return flows or even a logical estimate of return flows from groundwater and stored water during the summer months, those pre-1914 and most senior appropriative rights in the bottom end of the system, the bottom of the bathtub, would not be getting curtailed. In addition, the flip-flopping of the supply numbers based on the forecasting issues that we're having this summer are resulting in those water rights on the cusp being turned on and off from 1 week to another, one Tuesday to the next Tuesday, curtailed, not curtailed, because supply estimates are fluctuating by between 30 and 70,000 acre feet for the same month. So I would just strongly, strongly urge the board to do something about this anomaly. There is actually water that is in the system, both because the estimates of natural flow are off and because the methodology is excluding significant amounts in the context of what we're talking about in the dry months of summer of water that could serve these water rights on the cusp. For some of these districts that hold the water rights, I'll give you an example, Banta Carbona Irrigation District, at the bottom of the bathtub of the lower San Joaquin River, very few landowners in that district have access to groundwater. So when there is a curtailment and the water is otherwise flowing past their point of diversion, we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in crop damage. So I would just urge the board to be very cautious about curtailing on the cusp of what you have in your current methodology.
Thank you, Ms. Spalletta. And I know that we've been quite conservative when it's come to our approaches generally, but I really appreciate your good flags here. Just seeing if folks did want to respond. Jesse?
Yeah, thank you for your comments. We appreciate it. I do want to note that the return flow factors that are used, which use modeled data from DWR and Reclamation's Calcin 3 model, those do implicitly include return flows that result from diversions of previously stored water and from groundwater uses. These are not explicitly included as water supplies, but rather we feel that it's more appropriate to instead reduce demands using these return flow factors. And this is because return flows are in proportion to the amount of water that is diverted. And I want to note that in the San Joaquin watershed, in the month of July, we are using a return flow factor of 85%, which means that we're reducing all demands in the entire San Joaquin River watershed by 15% to account for these return flows. That's a total of over 117,000 acre feet of demand that's assumed to be met by these return flows and is taken out of the analysis. So while we are not taking the approach that commenters have suggested of adding these in as supplies, we don't think that's appropriate because return flows are in proportion to the amount of demand and diversion that occurs. And again, these calcium numbers are applied using estimates and using the best available data we have for the entire watershed as a whole. I don't think any comments that have been received regarding these have better estimates of consistent return flow data that can be applied across the watershed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jankowski. Ms. Spalletta, I think you'd like to respond, but I do see a board member anxious to ask something as well. Ms. Spalletta?
Thank you. I do appreciate Mr. Jankowski's comment about how the spreadsheet treats return flow. However, there is a mathematical problem with the way that the spreadsheet is deriving the return flow number. So the return flow number is a reduction in demand. As a practical matter, what that means is when we're sitting here in the middle of July and almost all of the water rights to which that reduced demand is being applied have been curtailed, the only return flow that is truly showing up in the spreadsheet is the 15% of the uncurtailed rights. So taking 15% of curtailed water rights doesn't actually generate any return flow for those water rights to use. So it's a mathematical problem with the methodology. 15% of a curtailed water right doesn't result in inner water right. So we only have 15% of the non-curtailed water rights that are contributing to return flow on the supply side of the spreadsheet. So the 117,000 is theoretical, not actual.
Okay, I think Mr. Jankowski has a response. I usually, don't. This is an important back and forth, but also maybe better reserved for a very in-depth technical conversation that you two can have. But Mr. Jankowski, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to add that I believe that's incorrect. When we're reducing demands for water across the scale of the watershed, that includes the demands senior to any given curtailed right. So I understand that those rights are curtailed, but those return flow factors are applied for all demands, regardless of whether or not they are curtailed. So the presence of those return flows is observable in any senior rights that would not be curtailed, as well as junior rights that are curtailed because there simply isn't enough water available to meet those demands, even when those demands are reduced to account for return flows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jankowski. And thank you, Ms. Spalletta, for the exchange. Board Member McGuire, did you want to ask or add?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the explanation. I had a similar mathematical conundrum going on in my mind about how exactly this would work. And I think I still do actually have a bit unresolved as it relates to the stored water and groundwater elements and how those would count or not count as supply when you're assuming it's a reduction on demand. So, perhaps we can put a pin in that and come back to it. Or if you'd like to,
something you want
further explain, maybe just saying it in a different way might help me better appreciate, how that, because in my mind, it does seem like there is some aspect of that return flow that should be represented as supply available for someone downstream. So am I missing something? Is that a wrong assertion, or just set me straight?
It's not a wrong assertion, but I think that what we're missing is that we're having to apply some simple math in order to do this operation. And essentially these return flow factors are calculated based on the magnitude of return flows in calcium, which is from all sources. It doesn't distinguish where those return flows are coming from. So it could be diversions of previously stored water or groundwater use. And that factor is calculated as a portion of surface water diversions. And then that factor is applied to the methodology's surface water diversions. Without getting into the math too much, if you were to increase that amount of surface water diversions, you say, I'm not including enough surface water diversions, and calculate that factor, that would actually result in applying fewer return flows. It might be better to have a conversation about the math offline, but again, we feel that this is kind of the best consistent method that reduces that applies return flows in proportion to the demands and diversions that would be generating those return flows. And, I will also add that adding return flows as a supply rather than reducing demand would have essentially the same effect. We're reducing demand, so there are fewer senior demands for water. If you were to instead increase supply, it would mean that, more water would be available to meet those full senior demands. So there might be some nuances and differences, but applying return flows as supplies versus a reduction to demands do have the same practical effect.
I'm not sure, maybe, but when you apply it uniformly, it can to me, in my mind, just implicitly have an effect on how the priority system is administered. And I think Ms. Valletta was talking about those who are kind of on the cusp. And so these types of assumptions could have impacts as I'm hearing it and understanding it today. I welcome a further conversation with you offline about this. But can you just, I think I'm understanding your rationale for the surface water piece. How about a groundwater example? So if there are significant groundwater pumpers in the San Joaquin Valley, how is it that they're not creating new potentially sources of supply in the river for surface water diverters with the return flows?
I do agree. And again, the magnitude of those groundwater diversions, the methodology doesn't apply to groundwater diversions. And so we're not including those demands anywhere in the methodology, but the magnitude of the supply, the return flow from those groundwater diversions is included in that it is relative to the amount of surface water diversions. So I think what I said is true for rediversions of stored surface water and groundwater. And I do think we'll probably need to have a conversation and walk you through the math of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Next commenter, I believe we have Susan Paulson.
All right. And is the technology working?
If you had a slide, it should be coming up here momentarily.
Yeah, no, I don't have a slide. I'm just checking to make sure that you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome.
Good afternoon.
Okay.
Good to see you, Ms. Paulson.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to participate remotely. Much appreciated to do the hybrid format. I'd like to just provide some verbal comments today and to focus on the revised June 27th version of Appendix D, which has formed the basis for the curtailment notices that were issued to Delta diverters on July 6th. I'd like to focus on the new, what I think is called a mass balance accounting approach of the new Appendix D. But I'd also like to reiterate some prior comments. So I don't want to dwell on them, but I want to just restate the fact that we continue to believe that the residence time approach in Appendix D is incorrect and is inconsistent with decades of prior peer-reviewed science and modeling, much of it produced by DWR. We also believe that it's inconsistent with the historical practices and observed conditions within the Delta. And specifically, the simplified box model approach to representing Delta channels and hydrodynamics is incorrect and overly simplified. So we've also stated before and continue to believe that creating arbitrary Delta regions and focusing on the inflows and consumptive uses in those regions is also too simplistic and fails to consider the information and measured data on in-Delta diversions and the availability of water historically to Delta diverters. And finally, we're still concerned about the water quality analysis. So for example, there's really no way for higher salinity water from Sassoon Bay or the West Delta to mix directly with water in the South Delta. And yet there are still examples of that as a specific example in the methodology in Appendix D. So I'd just like to incorporate our prior comments by reference on those topics. And there are really two things that I'd like to focus on in the new comments for today. One is that the new methodology defines a new quantity that's called the total Delta outflow. It's shown in Figure 5 of Appendix D, and it's computed as the difference between the inflow of natural and abandoned water to the Delta and Delta demand. And it appears, it's not quite clear, but it appears that the board wishes to curtail Delta diversions such that Delta diversions do not exceed the inflows of natural and abandoned water on essentially a real-time basis. But Appendix D doesn't spell out how the state board will calculate the inflows of natural abandoned water. And as previously mentioned by other commenters, the curtailment spreadsheets are really complex. So the methodology for determining these inflows of natural and abandoned water is not transparent. And we'd also note that the Delta Water Master released a draft ruling recently, just over a week ago, in response to a complaint submitted by the Friant Water Authority. And that draft ruling includes the following statement. I'll just quote from it. It says, according to the complainant's analysis, the reservoir releases, which are physically commingled in the Delta with other inflows, are not natural flow to which riparian water rights apply. As discussed above, the analyses conducted as part of this investigation could not accurately estimate or quantify the amount of inflow to the legal delta attributable to the release of previously stored project water, and therefore could not quantify the natural and abandoned flow entering the legal delta. And I believe that's the end of the quote. I believe that the investigation that is referenced was conducted jointly by the State Water Board and the Friant Water Authority, and so would appear to call into question the methodology that is proposed in Appendix D. The draft ruling itself that was released just over a week ago is incomplete, but it includes a placeholder for a section entitled Identifying Alternative Bases to Support Curtailments Through Collaborative Processes. And we agree that alternative bases are needed and that a collaborative process would be a great way to try to arrive at an alternative methodology. But even beyond this, and assuming that the inflows of native water and native and abandoned water can be computed, really the only way to compute delta outflow is to consider all inflows, including inflows of project water, and all outflows, including project exports. So the methodology in Appendix D purports to calculate what's shown in that figure 5 I referenced by subtracting project inflows from all other delta flows. And it appears to assume that if project flows weren't present, all other quantities would remain the same. And that's not accurate, and it really doesn't have real world relevance. So we've provided additional detail on that in our written comments and believe that to be accurate, a mass balance accounting approach needs to account for all mass, including the mass, the inflows of water and the exports of water that are attributable to the projects. And finally, staff said earlier in the morning today that no one has provided information regarding how to use the DSM-2 model and the information it would generate in curtailment decisions. We would note first that the DSM-2 model is by definition a mass balance model. The new total delta outflow that's mentioned in the methodology doesn't appear to consider all the inflows and all the outflows from the delta, and therefore really isn't a mass balance accounting. When we came before the board in May, and in comments we presented in May, we shared DSM-2 model runs that we performed using information from the state board spreadsheets regarding the inflows of natural and project water within the delta that were estimated for last year, for 2021. Our model analyses showed the source of water throughout the delta on a daily basis through the May to September 2021 time period. And in our testimony, we suggested ways in which this information could be used to determine curtailments within the delta, and we offered to participate in further discussions on that topic. We are very mindful about overstepping into policy or legal areas, but we're confident that the technical information that is generated by a model such as DSM-2 can be used to determine curtailments that are soundly based in best available science. We've also offered to provide technical assistance to state board staff regarding how to run the DSM-2 model, as have others who've contributed to these proceedings, and that offer stands. So in summary, the DSM-2 model is peer-reviewed. It provides detailed information on the hydrodynamics of the delta, on salinity conditions within the delta, and on the distribution of water from different sources within the delta. It can be run in near real time, and pre-processing and post-processing can be readily automated. So again, we've offered to help the board set this up and believe that technically it can and should be used as the basis for curtailment decisions inside the legal delta because of its strongly tidal nature. And we remain available for further discussions. We really appreciate the time and the efforts of staff and of the board members, and we would be happy to contribute to those discussions and provide further technical assistance as well. So thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Ms. Paulson. Appreciate your good comments. Ms. Riddle, is there anything that you wanted to comment to?
I'll turn it over to Scott. I think he has some responses to some of the issues raised.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you, Ms. Paulson, for offering your suggestions. I will go back through and listen to your presentation from last year where you suggest maybe ways that we could use DSM-2. We first of all, we do use DSM-2 in work such as the update of the Bay Delta plan. We have staff expertise in this. We have explored trying to figure out how we could use this model to inform the curtailment decisions. And really we haven't come up with the way. So I guess more details that you might have on how we could determine, with the water availability coming into the Delta and the Delta demands, how we would determine which water rights would have access to that water and who, and those details we haven't come down to figuring out. So if you have detailed comments, we'd appreciate it. A couple other things you commented on. One would be how the natural and abandoned Delta inflows were calculated and what those represent. I can hand it over to Jesse, or maybe we need to add something in an update to make that more clear. But those come directly from the methodology. So those are the same forecasts from the CNRFC's water supply and the demands that are reported. And so it's the amount of supply that would be available to meet those demands in the Delta at that level of curtailment. And so, and what you saw, and I think you referenced, I think it was figure 5 in Appendix D. So that inflow was the inflow to meet those the level of demand in the Delta. And then it shows the total demand in the Delta. So if there's no curtailment in the Delta, you see that the Delta outflow goes negative. And so you seem like there wasn't, you weren't clear on that term, that total Delta outflow term. And so maybe a better way to just label that would have been natural and abandoned Delta outflow. And so you had your understanding of how it was calculated correct. I just wanted to clarify that.
I think the one other issue that I wanted to mention, and I don't believe it was in Ms. Paulson's comments, was related to the complaint, which is a very different matter than the methodology. The methodology looks at water unavailability over the entire watershed. The complaint was focused on a complaint that riparians in the Delta were taking water that was unavailable to them, that was project stored water. It did not consider all of the demands in the watershed. So that it's not, those conclusions from that complaint, I don't think can be implied to apply to the methodology, given that in the methodology, we are looking at demands over the entire watershed and the remaining supply available within the legal Delta. So I think they're different matters, and the conclusions reached are not inconsistent for that reason.
Thank you. I can't help but feel for some of the issues Ms. Paulson, Ms. Spalletta, and others have highlighted, with updates to the methodology will further be refined again because we're getting more to a granular scale when it comes to some of the fairness and some of this. So anyway, thank you. Let's move on to Dean Ruiz. And then we have one more commenter after that.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. Good morning or afternoon.
Good afternoon, actually, yes. My name is Dean Reese. I'm submitting these comments on behalf of the South Delta Water Agency. SDWA submitted comments, and we incorporated the comment letter of our hydrologist, Tom Burke from Hydrologic Systems Incorporated. So we would encourage you to consider those comments as well. In order for the emergency curtailment regulation and the methodology to be understandable and more accurate and more reflective of Delta hydrodynamics, we posed 4 threshold questions in our comments, and I won't go through those in detail again, but I do want to highlight those here briefly. The first question was, do the Delta channels naturally contain water at all times? We believe the answer to that is obviously yes. And if staff somehow feels otherwise, then we need to know that quickly as part of this process. The second question is, does a riparian or pre-1914 right depend on the quality of the water to be diverted pursuant to those rights? We also believe the answer to that question is clear, and it is a resounding no. This question begs for an analysis and response as part of this process, because one of the underpinnings of the methodology is that it fails to account for the water that enters the delta from the west on the tide cycles. And it really does this without any real justification other than some summary language that there's a belief that it wouldn't be of adequate quality and therefore usable for beneficial uses, which of course doesn't account for the mixing of the water from the west with all other sources in the delta. Moreover, we're not aware of any legal authority to support the notion that delta diverters are not allowed to divert due to poor or alleged poor water quality. That decision to divert is for them to make on their own. And if there is any legal authority that staff believes exists to support this notion, we would like to know that and to have that and for that to be part of this process. STWA and CDWA have previously submitted, and Mr. Nomalini did it again today with reference to the 1931 Water Supervisors Report that showed Southern Delta farmers were able to divert and beneficially use water all the way through the summer of 1931 during the bottom of the worst drought on record. So we believe that also supports these positions and begs for analysis as part of this process. The third question we posed is, are water sources other than the San Joaquin River naturally in the Southern Delta? We believe and know that answer is yes, but this must be and should be thoroughly analyzed as part of this process, particularly if staff somehow feels the answer to that question is no. The fourth question that we posed is, can in Delta riparians and pre-1914 right holders divert when previously stored water is entering the Delta? We believe, again, the answer to this question is yes, and we've cited, as we have in the past in our comments, the Butte Canal case. We again request that staff, as part of this methodology process, address this issue, particularly in connection with the fact that there is always water in the Delta channels. The questions we have posed are not new. We realize we are in a drought and things are moving quickly. But because these are not new issues and they were posed in the past, including last year during this time when the process was going on, they need to be, we believe, answered and addressed publicly as part of this process. And once these questions, these very simple 4 threshold questions are answered, we believe it should be clear that curtailment of Delta diverters cannot occur based on the current methodology. And we're hopeful that these questions can be, for once, and completely thoroughly addressed as part of the process. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. I appreciate your questions and your contributions to the continued discussion. Next, I'll move on to our final commenter, Lucinda Shi.
Hello, thank you. My name is Lucinda Shi, and I'm the Water Resources Manager at Contra Costa Water District. I apologize that Deanna Serena, who was planning to speak today, had an emergency, so I am filling in for her, but we work together closely, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for the opportunity to provide comments on this important topic. As you know, as you may know, Contra Costa Water District, we're an in-delta diverter, and we provide drinking water to over 500,000 people in the Bay Area. Our service area is within the Western Delta and then continuously adjacent to the West. We rely on local Delta water rights as well as a CVP contract for our water supply. And we have, in our sort of unique position, been supportive of the State Water Board's efforts throughout this drought to administer water rights priorities and in order to conserve stored water to protect both water quality and environmental needs. Today, I wanted to focus on the water unavailability methodology, specifically, as mentioned by many people already, the technical Appendix D. I believe the State Board can and should continue to improve upon this methodology through an open and transparent process, as discussed by many others today. And the regulation, if it's adopted today, should use the latest methodology as it is updated. I think this is very important. Contra Costa Water District has always been a big believer in sound science above everything. We have, as you know, been providing comments in the state board's workshops on the water unavailability analysis throughout this process. Today, I will be restating and elaborating on some of those comments. The issues that we flagged previously have not been incorporated in this latest revision of Appendix D. I recognize that some of the loudest voices against issues are litigants against the state board. So I worry that some of the issues that we are raising may have been dismissed as combat science. So I'm here, Contra Costa Water District wants to be here today in an attempt to be an honest broker to make sure that your decisions are based on sound science. I really want to flag for you that there is an analysis in Technical Appendix D that is quite simply in error. The Appendix D relies on a box model analysis of the delta, and it defines something that it terms a tidal mixing time, which it implies, the Appendix D implies that that's equivalent to delta residence time. However, that methodology is not valid in our delta, and the results of the invalid methodology contradict published peer-reviewed studies of our estuary. Estuary mixing and residence time, it's a complicated but robust field of study. The box model in Appendix D is commonly called the simple tidal prism model, and it's been around since the early 1900s. It's a very simple model with two very extreme assumptions: that the estuary is completely and uniformly mixed, and that water that leaves the box on the ebb tide does not return on the flood tide. So around 1950, it was recognized that those assumptions do not hold for most estuaries. The types of estuaries that can be modeled with the simple tidal prism model are small estuaries with very little freshwater inflow. For instance, maybe applicable to some lagoons or harbors. Over the last 70 years, however, the simple tidal prism model has been modified by numerous researchers to address these limitations. But Appendix D relies only on the inappropriate simple tidal prism model. As implemented, the tidal mixing time methodology in Appendix D does not accurately represent delta flows, salinity intrusion, and the water that would be available to delta water rights. Furthermore, Appendix D dismisses the use of existing, well-documented delta hydrodynamic models by saying that it is infeasible to run model simulations and analyze the results for every update of the forecast hydrology. I recognize that this is, again, there's emergency, the drought conditions, there's a lot of workload, but real-time modeling not only feasible, but it is actively done by DWR, for instance, on about a weekly basis, following the requirement imposed by this board for the water quality response plan. Also, CCWD, we have extensive experience both with developing both pre and post processors for delta hydrodynamic models, which we use to streamline analysis for things like real-time emergency spill response. Anyway, rather than dive into these technical issues at this time, we asked that we could meet with state board staff, and of course, any board members who are interested as well, to discuss these technical issues and explore options for revising Appendix D to accurately reflect the well-established physics of our estuary and the availability of commonly available, commonly understood modeling tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shee. And yes, please do follow up. We're here to continue to explore, as we know, we've discussed, and we know very complex technical issues here in the process of curtailment. And so we welcome that engagement. I welcome it as well. Certainly, as we further contemplate today's action and wherever the board goes, we will continue to make sure we engage. And I know, especially as the methodology is looked to be updated, later this summer, and there's engagement then. The Delta is certainly its own special, unique place. And so I think, we'll certainly have the space to have a discussion around how all that fits together. So just thank you. I appreciate your engagement and comments today, and that of Contra Costa County Water District. Thank you. Okay, that does wrap up what we have now for commenters, I believe, Ms. Townsend, unless there's anyone that I've missed. And if there's anyone on the Zoom platform that for some reason we have not gone to, just raise your hand. Fellow board members, colleagues. Further questions or comments from anything that we've heard? Floor is anyone's here. Board Member McGuire, you want to kick us off?
Yes, I will do my best. Thank you. These are obviously very challenging questions, and the question of how do we curtail or make decisions on the water right priority system with its dual system of riparian and appropriative and 17,000 different water rights, many of which have been not well understood over the history of time. I can appreciate the complexity and the challenges in doing that and administering the system in a fair way. And so, I just, when I think, a lot of the comments here today have been about the methodology, Appendix D, how do we manage the delta, and specific elements. And, my questions about return flows and adding onto that are, just one piece of a puzzle that has many, many pieces to it. And so, I can certainly appreciate that we are in a drought emergency. I mean, I'm heartened that there's better storage in some respects than where we were last year, but I still have all the same concerns that we don't know how long this drought will go. We don't know how deep it will dive. And so we do need to have a process and an approach in place to implement and manage the priority system, which is a task that we're charged with and our responsibility here. So I just want to come out and say that I am committed to moving forward today with the regulations. That said, I think there have been a lot of good comments, and not just ones that have been raised today, but ones that have been raised over months. I'm about the technical aspects of how do we approach this. I'm really encouraged to hear that you're working on perhaps a new approach with different tools to enhance the ways that we can consider curtailments going forward. I'm encouraged to hear that you're open to discussions on how do we consider the delta water users and the availability there, and do we have tools there that we can also take advantage of here going forward that can give us a better sense for what level of curtailments should be enacted on. So for me, I think, and I'm also thinking about SJTA's comments about process and transparency, and I appreciated that input. So for me, it's, more of a question of where do we go from here? How can we do this in a way that is transparent and does tee up these issues in an appropriate time frame that we can identify what changes are in the realm of possibility and have those prepared and implemented in a way that they can be ready for the coming months. And I'm not thinking about the immediate, the rest of the summer. I think we have what we have here today. Maybe there can be some minor modifications, but I'm more of thinking, what can we do to be ready for next year? And so, Ms. Riddle, you had said some things when getting back to transparency. You had said, we can consider sharing red lines. It gets complicated. It's hard to do. Moving paragraphs around and things like that. I'm just wondering, how can we get from we can consider this to actually making some of these things happen? Do you need to hear from us today about that? At what point?
No, I should have said we can do that. If it's a strong enough desire, we can do that, and we will continue to summarize the changes as well and the reason for those changes in the beginning of the document, and hopefully facilitate where something's an actual non-substantive change and those kinds of things. So we can certainly commit to do that. And definitely happy. I think we want to be as transparent as possible. And on all of these comments related to improvements, if someone submits an actual, proposal that we can understand and evaluate its merits, we're absolutely happy to consider that. So we want this to be the best tool that it can be. We don't really have, a dog in the fight. It's all, we want the best tool it can be. So whatever people bring us, we're happy to look at it. So I think it just needs to be a sufficient enough detail that we can understand what the proposal means. I think there have been lots of comments made, but I think we need a little more detail on exactly how different stakeholders would suggest that we utilize different tools, and then we can have a specific dialogue about how we could do that or whether it's appropriate or not.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And the last comment area I wanted to just get some better understanding, just some clarification on, is the language that was added with regard to the Sacramento River settlement contractors and Ms. Jean Salezi's comments. So I was wondering if you could just explain or address her concerns about the appropriateness of including that language.
Sure, I'll go ahead and get started and let Dave chime in if appropriate. I think, as you're aware, this year, the Sacramento River settlement contractors agreed to a reduction in their overall use under both their water rights and their supplemental contractual arrangements with the Bureau of Reclamation, in recognition that there are limited amounts of storage in Shasta Reservoir that are needed for various purposes, including temperature management, carryover storage, health and safety. In recognition of those limitations in a more complex assessment of availability than what we do on a water unavailability basis, which is looking at allocating every last drop of water in order of priority in real time. It's not looking at the seasonal aspects of availability. It's really just looking at, in this week, is water available at this priority of right? And if not, then we curtail that right. So it doesn't encapsulate the more complex considerations that went into the decisions related to the reductions to the Sacramento River settlement contractors that took place this year. Those reductions took place in order to protect carryover storage, cold water pools, make sure that we have enough water going into next year, given the sequential drought years that we've experienced, and a very critical component of the water supply infrastructure that Shasta Reservoir maintains. Those demands were not reduced in order to make water available for more junior diverters. Those demands were reduced in consideration of those greater objectives for management of the system. So as a result, we believe as staff that it's appropriate that those flows should not become available to more junior water right holders. And what we're talking about here is not the contractual allocations. This is the water that a settlement contractor could have taken under their underlying water right or claim of right. Because the contracts are managed differently than water rights, they're different beasts. The way the contracts were cut was across the board. It was they received a 18% allocation that wasn't based on water right priority, like we implement the water right priority system in order of seniority. Some senior users would have been cut less. Some junior users would have been cut more under a water right priority system. So as a result, it results in some seniors voluntarily reducing their use in recognition of this greater plan to maintain reservoir storage. So we don't believe, because of that reason, that it's reasonable for that water to be made available to a junior user. That cut was not taken in order to make the water available to a junior user. The proposed regulation provisions recognize that. And the plan that we're referring to, I believe there was a question about that, the temperature management plan and the associated operations plan around that, they're attempting to limit releases from Shasta Reservoir and preserve storage in Shasta Reservoir are the plans that are being referred to. There will, if we're in a similar circumstance next year, there's a possibility that we would be in this circumstance again, and there would be a subsequent plan that would also come into play. Anything you'd add, Dave?
No, I mean, if that answers your question, Board Member McGuire, I'll also note that Ms. Alesi mentioned Water Code Section 1707 as being the usual mechanism that could, in other cases, do what's in part being done by this new provision that's proposed to be added. But of course, it's not exactly the right fit for what we're doing here under this drought emergency regulation, nor is it required that 1707 be the only mechanism through which this could be done. So what we're trying to do here is be very clear as to what's being done and how, and everything Diane just said really, I think, appropriately explains at least the thought process behind it and what we're trying to implement, assuming we've explained it adequately.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm satisfied with that explanation, and I'm comfortable with the language as it's written at this point. I do share Ms. Stelezzi's concerns about, again, going back to the transparency piece. I wasn't even fully clear what the operations plan was, honestly, that was being referred to. So, Ms. Riddle, you just clarified that it's perhaps the temperature management plan and the operations plan that goes along with that. So that's actually very helpful to know. So I think, those kinds of nuances and just making sure that we're being very clear to everyone what we mean by certain references, I think is really important here, especially with such a complicated approach. So thank you. That's all I have for now. And I do just want to say thank you so much, just echoing your comments right from the beginning about the incredible amount of work that is taken and the large team. I am deeply appreciative of everything and all the time and the late nights and the weekends. And I know you've spent really dedicated a lot of your energy to making sure that we're continuing to operate the system well, and it's not an easy task. So thank you very much.
Thank you, board member. Vice Chair.
Well, I think that was a good question and dialogue. And for me, on the settlement contractors, I think it gets down to a policy call as to reasonableness. And on the one hand, and looking for ways to be flexible to achieve a purpose. But at the same time, it causes me to think, are we going to be so broad with the use of reasonableness as we move forward in successive dry years, that we're undercutting the water rights system? I don't see that with this, but it's just something that I'm going to flag, that something to be considering. At what point are we overdoing use of the term reasonableness? I don't think we're there on this. The other thing that I just wanted to maybe suggest, and I've done this with respect to an upcoming workshop for biological goals, I'm really looking for opportunities where we can have more of a dialogue. And it just strikes me that when I have followed some of the workshops, the format doesn't seem to quite work. We'll hear from staff. There'll be a PowerPoint on the screen, especially if it's remote. There'll be the PowerPoint on the screen, and then staff seems to disappear, at least from the screen, and we have a facilitator that's hearing from people making comments. And I felt that today's dialogue between Ms. Spalletta and you all, and then Board Member McGuire's follow-up questions, it allowed for a more robust discussion. And so I would, and I know that if we do this in all instances, that we're never going to get anything done, because it's going to be the counterpoint. Somebody else is going to have an idea. So just asking you to consider that as you go forward with these additional opportunities for interaction with the public, to look for ways to improve that public interaction so that it can be more of a dialogue, especially on those challenging issues like some of the ones we talked about today, not just settlement contractors, but use of DSM-2 and some of the other issues that we talked about. And I'm just want to reiterate, I really want to thank you all and the stakeholders for being so engaged. It sounds like you've committed to that red line. And I'll just say that, for me, and I think that a lot of times we're talking about attorneys and modelers that are looking at this. I don't get scared by a lot of the red line stuff, because especially if you attach a list of the changes and you indicate that you had to move a paragraph, then you can easily follow that. But without that, then and you're trying to read through it, then and not all the red line is in there, then I think that it causes one to feel like they have to spend the time to read through the whole document to look for something else. So that's just my comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And share your desire to always be looking to improve how it is that we conduct our workshops and our discussions, and know that there's also plenty of opportunity in just private discussion, not just in workshop format, and but appreciate the eye toward that too. Board Member Morgan, anything you wanted to flag, any comments or questions?
I just would also just like to thank staff and the stakeholders for the tremendous amount of work and collaboration that has been done to get us to this point today. And for staff for their commitment to further transparency as we move forward. I also appreciate that the model can be updated as new information becomes available and as we move forward. And just speaking on that, topic, I really do look forward to continued conversations with staff and with stakeholders to further understand, the simplifications that have been made that were discussed today, and also the technical aspects of the model. And so just looking forward to that. And if we're ready, I am willing to make a motion.
I think we are.
Okay, I will make a motion to adopt the resolution.
Thank you, Board Member. And I'll just note, again, incredible thanks, and that we don't have a perfect tool. It would have really required a few decades of consistent investment in a perfect water rights system here to enact. But I feel wholeheartedly that we do have a process of continual improvement here and a real opportunity to make our way through what are a number of other challenging issues before us, but in a way that lets us move forward faster here in this last year than we've moved in decades. So just really appreciate everyone's good work, and would open it up for a second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Townsend, can you please call the roll call vote?
Board Member Morgan?
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo?
Aye.
Board Member McGuire?
Aye.
Chair Esquivel?
Aye.
Thank you all.
Thank you as well. The vote carries and the item is adopted. Thank you, everyone, for, again, the incredible work, the continued incredible work. This doesn't mark the end of anything, regrettably. The summer's still here before us. There's a lot to do. So just thank you. And thank you, importantly, to everyone that's engaged in this discussion and is part of our success here in engaging and having difficult conversations, but at a really important time. So thank you, everyone. That concludes item number 10 then, and here concludes our two-day board meeting. Our next board meeting will be on August 2nd and 3rd. Until then, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the last 2 days of engagement. Look forward to talking to you all between now and the next board meeting. And until then, stay safe and be well. Thanks, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.